The content of Economic Problems of Socialism in the USSR suggests that this work of J.V. Stalin became the property of the people, having passed the heterogeneous self-censorship of the crowd elite society in exactly the following way. The executive apparatchiks thoughtlessly did not understand and let it go to press. The more deeply thinking world behind the scenes, acting through its periphery, did not manage to prevent the publication and spreading of this work in society. This work is characterized by the fact that it is impossible to read it unambiguously without an understanding of the general course of global history. In other words, as the understanding of the general course of global history is, so is the meaning extracted by the reader from Economic Problems of Socialism in the USSR. If there is no understanding of the general course of history, then the named work of J.V. Stalin is a collection of platitudes and senseless Marxist chatter. There are many people, fruitlessly dreaming of communism, having not freed themselves from the power of Marxism over their world understanding, who refer to Economic Problems of Socialism in the USSR precisely as an example of the development by J.V. Stalin of Marxist theory oriented towards the building of communism. They do not realize that this work is a death sentence to Marxism, but expressed in the linguistic forms of Marxism itself. They do not realize this fact in the same way as it was not realized in 1952 by the guardians of J.V. Stalin from the apparatus mafia and from the world behind the scenes, allowing the publication of this collection of articles and letters responses to the participants in the economic discussion. This erroneous opinion stems from two circumstances. First, the unwillingness and ineptitude of people in independently comprehending the course of life. Second, in Economic Problems of Socialism in the USSR, there are many phrases that give the impression that J.V. Stalin is a faithful servant of Marxism. One of the more impressive phrases of this kind goes like this. To describe Comrade Yaroshenko's opinion in a couple of words, it should be said that it is un-Marxist and hence profoundly erroneous. In other words, only an approach to emerging problems from the standpoint of Marxism provides the keys to their solution and thereby enriches Marxist science. Marxism regards laws of science, whether they be laws of natural science or laws of political economy, as the reflection of objective processes which take place independently of the will of man. Man may discover these laws, get to know them, study them, reckon with them in his activities, and utilize them in the interests of society, but he cannot change or abolish them. Still less can he form or create new laws of science. And accordingly, for success in the building of communism, it is necessary to educate the younger generations in the spirit of Marxism-Leninism. Hence, the laws of political economy under socialism are objective laws, which reflect the fact that the processes of economic life are law-governed and operate independently of our will. People who deny this postulate are, in point of fact, denying science. And by denying science, they are denying all possibility of prognostication, and consequently are denying the possibility of directing economic activity. It may be said that all this is correct and generally known, that there is nothing new in it, and that it is therefore not worth spending time reiterating generally known truths. Of course, there really is nothing new in this, but it would be a mistake to think that it is not worth spending time reiterating certain truths that are well known to us. The fact is that we, the leading corps, are joined every year by thousands of new and young forces who are ardently desirous of assisting us and ardently desirous of proving their worth, but who do not possess an adequate Marxist education, are unfamiliar with many truths that are well known to us, and are therefore compelled to grope in the darkness. They are staggered by the colossal achievements of Soviet government. They are dazzled by the extraordinary successes of the Soviet system, and they begin to imagine that Soviet government can do anything, that nothing is beyond it, that it can abolish scientific laws and form new ones. During the life of one generation, the Soviet people went from almost universal illiteracy, plows and splinters, to the highest level of education in the world. Industry on the basis of advanced for their time designs and technologies, and prepared for the first flights into space. Continuing the quote, "What are we to do with these comrades? How are we to educate them in Marxism-Leninism? I think that the systematic reiteration and patient explanation of so-called generally known truths is one of the best methods of educating these comrades in Marxism." When reading these fragments from Economic Problems of Socialism in the USSR, if one does not delve into the meaning of certain details, the general impression is that this is a typical example of campaigning for the study of Marxism and the propaganda of Marxism as a theoretical basis for the building of communism. However, what we have shown in the given selection of fragments is a template of perception, slipped to believers in Marxism who do not know it and who do not understand life, which allows them to calmly classify J.V. Stalin as a Marxist, and therefore not interfere with the spread of this work in society, in the culture of which the cult of Marxism is dominant. And there is more than one such template of perception in Economic Problems of Socialism in the USSR that unambiguously leads to the opinion, this is Marxism. Therefore, everyone who wants to believe this, not wanting to think and take responsibility for themselves, believe that J.V. Stalin was a true Marxist who creatively developed the Marxist legacy in relation to the new historical conditions, or that he was stupid, like all Marxists, and therefore tried to solve the emerging problems on the basis of Marxism without leaving its framework. If one does delve into the comprehension of precisely the details distributed throughout the text of Economic Problems of Socialism in the USSR, knowing Marxism at least in its main provisions, then this work in its content is merciless anti-Marxism, having quietly infiltrated into the authoritative classics of Marxist literature of those years, speaking in the common language of Marxism. Its anti-Marxist essence is one of the reasons as a consequence of which Marxists of the subsequent time recall it neither well nor badly. If they don't understand, then they at least sense. Discussing it in society is the public death sentence for Marxism. Indeed, as Marxism teaches, the fundamental question of any philosophy is the question of the relationship of consciousness to being, thinking to matter, nature, considered from two sides. First, what is primary? Spirit or nature, matter or consciousness? And secondly, how does knowledge about the world relate to the world itself? Or, in other words, does consciousness correspond to being? Is it capable of correctly reflecting the world? This problematics can be raised to the rank of the fundamental question only by the orderers of philosophy designed to tear a person away from life and make him dependent on the interpreters of the flow of life events, who rely on some other philosophy that they conceal from the rest of society. This is so because without any intellectual tricks and logical proofs and historical philosophical erudition, for most people, one way or another forced to solve big and small problems in their lives on a daily basis, the following is intuitively clear. Regardless of the answer to the first component of the question, spirit, i.e. God, is primary, nature, the product of spirit, God, is secondary, or nature is primary, human consciousness is secondary, a person is not able to change the objectively existing given of being. And the answer to the question, which of the two opinions corresponds to the objective truth lies outside the realm of proofs by means of any logic, which is confirmed by the millennia-long, endless dispute between logical and quotation-dogmatic philosophical schools of scientific materialism and occultism, scientific idealism. On the second component of the fundamental question of Marxist-Leninist philosophy, it is also intuitively clear to the majority, without any logical tricks, that knowledge about the world may or may not correspond to the world itself. In those cases where people act on the basis of knowledge corresponding to the world, their activity is successful. If they act on the basis of knowledge or false knowledge, illusory views, that does not correspond to life circumstances, then their activity achieves results worse than expected before its start, up to the point that it suffers a complete collapse, and this can entail a great number of human victims and natural disasters. And therefore, the only philosophy that has real practical significance in the daily life of the majority is a philosophy that is capable of giving answers to questions in real life. Will the results of an activity be worse than those which were desired before the start? Or will they be no worse, that is, exactly as it was supposed, or even better than was desired before the start? In other words, the fundamental question of practically useful wisdom is the question of the predictability of consequences with a detailedness sufficient for the conduct of activities by people, including the governance towards circumstances, both alone and collectively in real-life circumstances. And according to this practically useful everyday wisdom, which has nothing to do with the far-fetched logical and schizophrenic construction of Marxism, in which the problems of governance are not considered either in general or in any particular aspects, undermining the dominance of Marxism and the fundamental question of its philosophy over the minds of people in society, J.V. Stalin writes, "The laws of political economy under socialism are objective laws which reflect the fact that the processes of economic life are law-governed and operate independently of our will. People who deny this postulate are, in point of fact, denying science, and by denying science, they are denying all possibility of prognostication, and consequently are denying the possibility of directing economic activity." In Marxism, the problematics of prognostication and governance towards all kinds of processes and the organization of their self-governance are not considered, and the philosophy and political economy of Marxism are structured in such a way as to impede the understanding of processes of governance on the basis of prognostication in general and in economics in particular. And it is precisely because of all this that what is written by J.V. Stalin in this fragment has no meaningful relation either to Marxism or to its so-called creative development in relation to new historical conditions. However, it is known that from a sufficiently large text covering a wide range of dissimilar problems, one can extract quotations, arrange them in a certain sequence, comment on them, and thus, in words, prove practically any pre-ordered conclusion. Nonetheless, this shown by us non-Marxist approach of J.V. Stalin to the problem of governing the economic life of society is not the result of this kind of abuse of the selection of facts and the logic of their comprehension. According to our statement of the problem of organizing the governance towards the economic life of society, J.V. Stalin expresses his rejection of Marxist political economy, on the basis of which the organization of governance towards the economic activity of society, either practically or theoretically, is impossible. Absolutely mistaken, therefore, are those comrades who allege that, since socialist society has not abolished commodity forms of production, we are bound to have the reappearance of all the economic categories characteristic of capitalism: labor power as a commodity, surplus value, capital, capitalist profit, the average rate of profit, etc. These comrades confuse commodity production with capitalist production and believe that once there is commodity production, there must also be capitalist production. They do not realize that our commodity production radically differs from commodity production under capitalism. Further, I think that we must also discard certain other concepts taken from Marx's Capital, where Marx was concerned with an analysis of capitalism and artificially applied to our socialist relations. I am referring to such concepts, among others, as necessary and surplus labor, necessary and surplus product, necessary and surplus time. Marx analyzed capitalism in order to elucidate the source of exploitation of the working class, surplus value, and to arm the working class, which was bereft of means of production, with an intellectual weapon for the overthrow of capitalism. It is natural that Marx used concepts, categories, which fully corresponded to capitalist relations. But it is strange, to say the least, to use these concepts now, when the working class is not only not bereft of power and means of production, but, on the contrary, is in possession of the power and controls the means of production. Talk of labor power being a commodity and of hiring of workers sounds rather absurd now under our system, as though the working class, which possesses means of production, hires itself and sells its labor power to itself. It is just as strange to speak now of necessary and surplus labor, as though, under our conditions, the labor contributed by the workers to society for the extension of production, the promotion of education and public health, the organization of defense, etc., is not just as necessary to the working class, now in power, as the labor expended to supply the personal needs of the workers and his family. It should be remarked that in his critique of the Gotha program, where it is no longer capitalism that he is investigating, but, among other things, the first phase of communist society, Marx recognizes labor contributed to society for extension of production, for education and public health, for administrative expenses, for building up reserves, etc., to be just as necessary as the labor expended to supply the consumption requirements of the working class. We will leave aside the question of commodity production and the market in the planned economy of a socialist state for the time being, and turn to identifying the meaning of the rest of the text and the subtext in the given fragment. If we discard from the political economy of Marxism such concepts as necessary and surplus labor, necessary and surplus product, necessary and surplus time, as J.V. Stalin directly and unequivocally suggests, then it will crumble into debris, and along with it, Marxism as a whole will collapse, since its political economy is a product of its philosophy, as a consequence of which the collapse of political economy will inevitably entail a revision of philosophy, and, as a further consequence, a revision of sociology as a whole, and the system of views about the history of global civilization and its prospects. However, economic theory and sociology as a whole is necessary for a socialist society. Starting with a seemingly casual, but in its essence deadly for Marxism proposal to discard the conceptual categories of Marxist political economy he enumerated, J.V. Stalin concludes the section with a direct instruction to scientists to work out a qualitatively new economic theory that corresponds to the life and social needs of governance towards the economy. I think that our economists should put an end to this incongruity between the old concepts and the new state of affairs in our socialist country by replacing the old concepts with new ones that correspond to the new situation. We could tolerate this incongruity for a certain period, but the time has come to put an end to it. But the question may arise, how to understand J.V. Stalin's direct references to Karl Marx, standing in the text between the proposal to abandon the conceptual categories of the political economy of Marxism and the proposal to scientists to work out an economic theory that corresponds to the reality of life. In this regard, it is useful to recall that J.V. Stalin was once a seminarian, and in the seminary he was taught well quotation dogmatic philosophy, which works on the principle: a question arises, look for a suitable quotation in authoritative sources. In order to be a good dogmatist, quota reader, it is necessary to know and remember well the texts of the works of the founders of the philosophical school and their students, commentators and successors, recognized by the established tradition as legitimate authorities. If the classics, raised to the rank of infallible authorities, were in some way mistaken, or did not consider some question, then quotation dogmatic philosophy turns out to be worthless for solving problems arising in life. But Stalin overcame the limitations of quotation dogmatic philosophical culture in his youth. This is expressed in his works in the fact that he could freely express his thoughts in the form of a sequence of quotations from generally recognized authoritative texts, combining different quotations within one narrative in his own words, entrusting his words with the mission of governing the meaning of the consolidated text, which includes quotations. The given fragment of the text of Stalin, with references to Karl Marx, to his works, where Karl Marx considered something and came to some conclusions, will not lose its meaning if references to Karl Marx are removed from it, and only the narrative is left. In other words, what is important in it is the meaning of what has been said, and not whether Karl Marx or someone else came to some conclusions on these or those questions or not. The same applies to the first fragment we quoted, which was about the objectiveness of the laws of science and the subjectiveness of their application, including for the governance towards the economic life of society. However, the presence in the text of references to Karl Marx, when considering the thematics chosen by J.V. Stalin, creates the appearance that economic problems of socialism in the USSR belongs to Marxist literature. Overall, however, this is anti-Marxist propaganda. The fact is that the reading of such texts depends on the reader. Those who read and memorize only words without considering the interconnections of words with real life, they are indifferent about the meaning of the words. But those who, sincerely wanting to understand life itself in the conditions of the domination of the cult of Marxism in society, inevitably face the imposition on them of Marxist templates of world understanding. They, statistically predeterminedly, will come to the question: why, in political economy, have the concepts, categories named by J.V. Stalin suddenly become irrelevant? And if those who ask this question stand firm in their aspiration to find an answer to it, they will not become Marxists, but will become the liberators of society from the power of Marxism and its behind-the-scenes masters. And the answer to the question we have named is simple and stems from a practical question that is natural to the point of childish naivety, which a thoughtful student of a natural science or technical profile will inevitably someday ask himself, or a teacher of Marxist political economy. And how to measure necessary and surplus labor time in real production activity. How to distinguish and separate necessary from surplus in the finished goods warehouse. There are no answers to such questions either in Marxism or outside of it. And the absence of answers to these questions implies the metrological inconsistency of Marxist political economy. there are no objective phenomena at the basis of its concepts, or the parameters chosen for describing objective phenomena do not lend themselves to identification and measurement in life. All true sciences are metrologically consistent. The phenomena they consider objectively exist. The parameters of objective phenomena, juxtaposed with their conceptual apparatus, are objectively identifiable and measurable. Only pseudosciences, including Marxism, are metrologically inconsistent. For example, transfer of value from means of production to product is a concept of Marxist political economy. In life, there is no such objective phenomenon, but there is an accounting procedure for attributing to the cost of production the amortization deductions, which are a juridically legalized share of the cost of the means of production of an enterprise. If J.V. Stalin had said bluntly that Marxism is a pseudoscience, then the society, intoxicated by the cult of Marxism, would hardly have agreed with him. The majority of individuals constituting society, not wanting to take care and responsibility, not wanting to think for themselves, would rather have agreed with the faithful Marxist psycho-Trotskyists, who would have slipped them an explanation that did not oblige them to rethink and review life. For example, something similar to the following. Comrade Stalin was fatigued from his hard work. He had a nervous breakdown, as a result of which his judgments became inadequate, and therefore he must be released from work, treated, and then given the rest he deserves in a cozy dacha under the supervision of the best doctors. However, J.V. Stalin said that Marxism is a pseudoscience between the lines, in the stream of representational imagery accompanying the text. For some, it went unnoticed, and some did not explain it to those who did not understand. But this shows that Economic Problems of Socialism in the USSR is a text that can be read only by those who feel life itself, and whose right hemisphere of the brain, responsible for representational imagery, carries out the function of conceptual thinking, functions normally, and not by itself, but in tune with the left, responsible for linguistic forms and logic of transitions. Thus, with one phrase about the conceptual categories of the political economy of Marxism, J.V. Stalin egregorially programmed the collapse of Marxism, and since a holy place is never empty, he also programmed the development in Russia of a kind of world understanding that would meet the needs of the Bolshevik global civilizational building. That is, he factually killed Marxism as a system of world understanding. And one should not think that J.V. Stalin killed Marxism allegedly by accident, out of his ignorance and intellectual primitiveness, not understanding the meaning of his own words, and not foreseeing the consequences of the publication of this work. Just as many Stalinists and anti-Stalinists of the past and present did not understand and do not understand the meaning of his words. J.V. Stalin struck the most vulnerable point of Marxism, struck it targetedly and mercilessly, with an infliction concealed from the enemy. Since then, Marxism has existed in the regime of a dead man zombie. Public Marxists never understood this, and Marxist esotericists, initially based on a different world view and world understanding, who only hide behind Marxism in their actions, are in no hurry to share this unpleasant for them news with their flocks. Economic Problems of Socialism in the USSR also contains the following very significant text. Should there be a special chapter in the textbook on Lenin and Stalin as the founders of the political economy of socialism? I think that the chapter, The Marxist Theory of Socialism, Founding of the Political Economy of Socialism by V.I. Lenin and J.V. Stalin, should be excluded from the textbook. It is entirely unnecessary, since it adds nothing and only colorlessly reiterates what has already been said in greater detail in earlier chapters of the textbook. In our opinion, servile contemporaries simply brought J.V. Stalin to the point where he could no longer write without sarcasm, either about the formed by that time Marxist theory of socialism and the political economy of socialism as a science, or about the role of V. Lenin and his own one in the creation of this intoxicating verbiage, the spread of which in society he alone, however, could not openly prevent. And by default, the same text is a mockery of those who were engaged in the creation of the personality cult of J.V. Stalin himself. And we think that those who have not lost their sense of humor and literary style will agree with our understanding of the given passage. However, direct evidence of J.V. Stalin's concern that there was no sociological theory in the USSR that met the needs of socialist and communist construction has also survived. Let us quote in confirmation an excerpt from an interview with R. Kosalapov, published in the newspaper Zavtra, number 50, 211, December 1997. From the end of the 50s till the beginning of the 70s, I had to collaborate with Dmitry Chesnakov, a former member of the Central Committee Presidium, who was exiled to Gorky in 1953. Khrushchev couldn't explain to him the reason for that. This is the opinion, and that's it. This is the same Chesnakov, whom Stalin, 1 or 2 days before his death, had told by telephone, "You should take up the further development of the theory as soon as possible. We can mix something up in the economy, but we will improve the situation somehow. If we make a mess of the theory, we will ruin everything. Without the theory, we are dead, dead, dead." Speaking in essence, if J.V. Stalin recognizes Marxism as a theory of building socialism and communism, then he has no reason to convince D.I. Chesnakov that without a theory, the cause of Bolshevism is dead. After all, as Comrade Lenin said, the Marxian doctrine is omnipotent because it is true. If J.V. Stalin definitely knows that there is something not right with Marxism, then his appeal to D.I. Chesnakov is a direct instruction to develop a sociological theory, alternative to Marxism, if one recalls what has already been said in Economic Problems of Socialism in the USSR. We could tolerate this incongruity between the conceptual apparatus of Marxism and real life for a certain period, but the time has come to put an end to it. Moreover, it must be understood that if the Marxian doctrine is omnipotent because it is true, then the words "we will ruin everything" in the conditions of the cult of Marxism, which embraces the entire society, are inappropriate. If the doctrine of Marx is nonsense, however, with which the heads of people are fooled, then, without the further development of the theory and the liberation on its basis of the minds of millions of people from the power of Marxism over them, the whole cause of the transition to a society of a previous community will inevitably be ruined and will have to restart anew under the harsh pressure of objective circumstances, but at a different historical time. In addition to remarks on economic questions connected with the November 1951 discussion, Economic Problems of Socialism in the USSR also includes reply to Comrade Alexander Ilyich Notkin concerning the errors of Comrade L.D. Yaroshenko, reply to Comrades A.V. Sanina and V.G. Venger. Those who think that in the era of J.V. Stalin there was a terrible tyranny, nonetheless should admit that all the comrades mentioned by name wished themselves to express their views on certain questions without fear that they would be convicted under Article 58 for counter-revolutionary activity if the tyrant did not agree with their opinions. None of them ended up in the Gulag, and L.D. Yaroshenko, who lived to see perestroika, even gave interviews about how Stalin did not understand the problems of the national economy and economic science. This fact, and indeed the testimonies of those who really worked with J.V. Stalin, solving various problems in the life of the country, demonstrate the slanderousness and deceit of the following statement of Khrushchev. Stalin acted not through persuasion, explanation, and patient cooperation with people, but by imposing his concepts and demanding absolute submission to his opinion. Whoever opposed these concepts or tried to prove his own viewpoint and the correctness of his own position was doomed to removal from the leadership collective and to subsequent moral and physical annihilation. This is from the so-called secret report of N.S. Khrushchev at the 20th Congress of the CPSU, which, 6 months later, was fully published in the United States. But until the very beginning of the struggle against Stalinism during Perestroika, was concealed from the peoples of the USSR. If N.S. Khrushchev personally, and others like him, were themselves ignorant and so cowardly that fear fettered their intellect to such an extent that it was impossible to convince them of anything, and the ideals of socialism and communism caused them unconscious disgust, an unmotivated rejection of decisions aimed at realizing it, then blaming Stalin for his own ignorance, nervous pervertedness, cowardice, and stupidity is despicable. All of the already mentioned chapters from Economic Problems of Socialism in the USSR, that is, reply to Comrade Alexander Ilyich Notkin concerning the errors of Comrade L.D. Yaroshenko, reply to Comrades A.V. Sanina and V.G. Venger, are in their subtext subordinated to the main idea of the collection. Bolshevism needs a sociological theory capable of freeing society, humanity as a whole, from the power of Marxism and the mafia of its masters. However, since these are works that are heterogeneous in terms of thematics and its significance, respectively, the hierarchy of priorities of generalized means of governance, we will consider them in accordance with the hierarchy of significance of the questions raised by Stalin in their interconnection. Therefore, let us continue our analysis of economic problems of socialism in the USSR from the opinion expressed by J.V. Stalin about the mistakes of Comrade L.D. Yaroshenko. Some time ago, the members of the Political Bureau of the CPSUB received a letter from Comrade Yaroshenko, dated March the 20th, 1952, on a number of economic questions which were debated at the November discussion. The author of the letter complains that the basic documents summing up the discussion and Comrade Stalin's remarks contain no reflection whatever of the opinion of Comrade Yaroshenko. Comrade Yaroshenko also suggests in his note that he should be allowed to write a political economy of socialism, to be completed in a year or a year and a half, and that he should be given 2 assistants to help him in the work. As previously reported, to describe Comrade Yaroshenko's opinion in a couple of words, it should be said that it is un-Marxist, and, hence, profoundly erroneous. But if J.V. Stalin really wanted a non-Marxist sociological theory, including political economy, to be developed in the USSR, then the question arises: why in Economic Problems of Socialism in the USSR did he publicly oppose L.D. Yaroshenko's proposal to be allowed to write a political economy of socialism, to be completed in a year or a year and a half, and that he should be given 2 assistants to help him in the work? Or, the same question in a different formulation: in what are the mistakes of Comrade Yaroshenko concluded, which have nothing to do with the question of his loyalty to Marxism? Having defined the formulation of this key question, let us turn to the text of J.V. Stalin. Under socialism, Comrade Yaroshenko says, men's production relations become part of the organization of the productive forces, as a means, an element of their organization. If that is so, what is the chief task of the political economy of socialism? Comrade Yaroshenko replies, "The chief problem of the political economy of socialism, therefore, is not to investigate the relations of production of the members of socialist society. It is to elaborate and develop a scientific theory of the organization of the productive forces in social production, a theory of the planning of economic development." That, in fact, explains why Comrade Yaroshenko is not interested in such economic questions of the socialist system as the existence of different forms of property in our economy, commodity circulation, the law of value, etc., which he believes to be minor questions that only give rise to scholastic disputes. He plainly declares that in his political economy of socialism, disputes as to the role of any particular category of socialist political economy, value, commodity, money, credit, etc., which very often with us are of a scholastic character, are replaced by a healthy discussion of the rational organization of the productive forces in social production, by a scientific demonstration of the validity of such organization. In short, political economy without economic problems. Comrade Yaroshenko thinks that it is enough to arrange a rational organization of the productive forces, and the transition from socialism to communism will take place without any particular difficulty. He considers that this is quite sufficient for the transition to communism. He plainly declares that under socialism, the basic struggle for the building of a communist society reduces itself to a struggle for the proper organization of the productive forces and their rational utilization in social production. Comrade Yaroshenko solemnly proclaims that communism is the highest scientific organization of the productive forces in social production. It appears then that the essence of the communist system begins and ends with the rational organization of productive forces. From the last two paragraphs, it should be clear that the assertion that communism, Bolshevism, means to confiscate and divide the property of others, systematically promoted by the Russian mass media and public politicians, including Boris Yeltsin, since 1985 and even more so after 1991, is the vile slander of fools on Bolshevism. That J.V. Stalin did not at all think that the achievement of a sufficiently high value by the range of production per capita would automatically lead to general prosperity in communism. This is a remark for those who see in communism and Bolshevism the spiritless desire of primitives to fill their bellies and grab some clothes. A little further in the text, continuing a more detailed examination of the views of L.D. Yaroshenko, Stalin expresses his thoughts with an appropriate quote from the legacy of Karl Marx. Marx said, "In production, men not only act on nature, but also on one another. They produce only by cooperating in a certain way and mutually exchanging their activities. In order to produce, they enter into definite connections and relations with one another, and only within these social connections and relations does their action on nature, does production, take place." Having demonstrated himself with the help of this quote to everyone who wants to be a true Marxist, J.V. Stalin continues his thought and again turns to the views of L.D. Yaroshenko. Consequently, social production consists of two sides, which, although they are inseparably connected, reflect two different categories of relations: the relations of men to nature, productive forces, and the relations of men to one another in the process of production, production relations. Only when both sides of production are present do we have social production, whether it be under the socialist system or under any other social formation. Comrade Yaroshenko, evidently, is not quite in agreement with Marx. He considers that this postulate of Marx is not applicable to the socialist system. Precisely for this reason, he reduces the problem of the political economy of socialism to the rational organization of the productive forces, discarding the production, the economic relations, and severing the productive forces from them. If we followed Comrade Yaroshenko, therefore, what we would get is, instead of a Marxist political economy, something in the nature of Bogdanov's universal organizing science. Hence, starting from the right idea that the productive forces are the most mobile and revolutionary forces of production, Comrade Yaroshenko reduces the idea to an absurdity, to the point of denying the role of the production, the economic relations, under socialism. And instead of a full-blooded social production, what he gets is a lopsided and scraggy technology of production, something in the nature of Bukharin's technique of social organization. The impression takes shape that the appeal to the non-Marxist views of Comrade Yaroshenko in economic problems of socialism in the USSR for J.V. Stalin is only a convenient excuse to warn against both empty chatter on the theme of the sufficiency of replacing a conceptually determined theory with a healthy discussion of the rational organization of the productive forces in a social production, and against attempts in the development of theory to rely on something qualitatively homogeneous to the universal organizing science of A. Bogdanov. As for the first, the so-called healthy discussion on the organization of processes of governance and self-governance in society at the rate of emergence of problems, J.V. Stalin, over the decades of his party and state work, especially after 1923, to the measure of the concentration into his hands of the highest party-state power, became skilled in this kind of healthy and erroneous discussion, flowing in the lexical forms of Marxism and economic science, the conceptual apparatus of which expressed the I-centric thinking of the elite of pre-socialist formations. And when these discussions were healthy, which was expressed in the successes of the economy of the USSR, they hid from people not involved in governance the factually absolute and hopeless practical theoretical inconsistency of Marxism, the state of affairs of which clearly did not satisfy J.V. Stalin. And the fact that claiming the healthiness of discussion free from disputes of a scholastic character, that is, from the need to determine the meaning of each of the concepts used and their interconnections with life and among themselves, L.D. Yaroshenko was not capable of healthy discussion, is convincingly shown by J.V. Stalin in his answer, if not to L.D. Yaroshenko himself, then to many readers of Stalin's work. This is clear if we understand that J.V. Stalin was not a Marxist, and L.D. Yaroshenko, not understanding either this fact or Marxism as such, claimed the creative development of Marxist theory in relation to new historical circumstances. Accordingly, using the example of L.D. Yaroshenko, under the guise of criticism of his non-Marxist views, J.V. Stalin showed the futility of attempts to creatively develop Marxism in relation to new historical circumstances, and ridiculed the tendency of healthy discussion to replace a conceptually determined, life-consistent theory. In general, as historical practice shows, so-called healthy discussion either results in the creation of life-consistent scientific theories that not only do not deny healthy discussion, but become their skeletal basis when solving problems facing society, opening up possibilities for people to understand both the problems themselves and the causes of their occurrence, as well as ways and methods of their solution, or remains I-centric idle chatter, with which sometimes quite wide social groups live, but which is not suitable for creation, and therefore much can be ruined with attempts to rely on it in the politics of society and the state. But there is also a third possibility, There are experts of healthy discussion whose speeches are designed to mislead other people, giving them false representational imagery about the phenomena of life, as a result of which, for healthy discussion, these people find themselves depending on those experts, the representational thinking of whom, despite their words, is still consistent with the objective phenomena of life. An earlier, but written example of this kind of healthy discussion on the themes of history and sociology is Mein Kampf by A. Hitler, and apparently J.V. Stalin actively wanted the peoples of the USSR to become free from the power over them and their destinies of this kind of healthy discussion. And, accordingly, the question of A. Bogdanov's universal organizing science raised by J.V. Stalin is more significant than the non-Marxist views of L.D. Yaroshenko himself and his inclination to healthy discussion, with claims to replace life-consistent theory with itself, and which became the basis for mentioning the problematics of universal organizing science as such. And this is also a conspiratorial question in the general context of economic problems of socialism in the USSR, although today's lovers of conspiracy theories do not delve into it. A. Bogdanov, Malinovsky, real name, Alexander Alexandrovich, 1873 to 1928, economist, philosopher, naturalist, politician, science fiction writer, member of the Social Democratic Party from 1896 to 1903, joined the Bolsheviks. His views were largely non-Marxist. In 1909, he was expelled from the party. Subsequently, he joined various party factions. After the Great October Socialist Revolution, he gradually retired from political activity and devoted himself to scientific work. He was a doctor by education, organizer and director from 1926 of the world's first blood transfusion institute, which later was named after him. He died on April 7, 1928, as a result of a medical blood transfusion experiment which he conducted on himself. From the scientific heritage of A. Bogdanov throughout the entire time, the greatest interest is caused by the universal organizing science, or by its other name, techtology. According to an article in the Great Soviet Encyclopedia, in techtology, A. Bogdanov was one of the pioneers of the systemic approach in modern science. In a number of recent studies by Soviet and foreign authors, it is noted that some provisions of techtology anticipated the ideas of cybernetics, the principle of feedback, the idea of modeling, etc. Universal Organizing Science is a large-scale, worldview treatise that many educated people have heard of, but few have read, because in Soviet times, as a work which, in terms of the views expressed in it, was non-Marxist, it was not republished, and it could be found only in special depositories of leading scientific libraries or in a small number of family book collections. It is an attempt to break free from the power of Marxism over the world understanding of a person on the basis of what, in its essence, is a version of the sufficiently general theory of governance in the forms of its presentation by A. Bogdanov. However, J.V. Stalin did not find this attempt successful, and he was right in this. If it had been successful, then, as a result of the appearance in 1913 of the first chapters of this work by A. Bogdanov, there would have been a restructuring of the algorithmics of the noosphere of Earth, and the problem of overcoming Marxism would have somehow been resolved in the first half of the 20th century. The history of the 20th century would have been different. Those who disagree with J.V. Stalin on this issue can find the works concerning techtology as a universal organizing science and start studying and mastering them. They would not be the first. After the collapse of the cult of Marxism in the USSR, many who understand that the science of governance is the key to everything follow this path. But before embarking on this path, it is better to see what those who have already learned something of it take away from the study of technology. Like any person in the fullness of his activity, J.V. Stalin had a border that separated what he understood quite definitely from what went beyond the boundaries of his understanding, and what was conditioned by the interaction of his psyche at the unconscious levels with egregors, with the psyches of other subjects, with guidance from above. This applies both to accomplished events, including the evaluation of technology, and current affairs, as well as foresight. However, regardless of where this border ran in the activities of J.V. Stalin, in the fact that in a few phrases in a pseudo-Marxist text, he egregorially programmed the death of Marxism and matrixly excluded the possibility of necessity of Bolsheviks in the future for any nraviously sterile, atheistic, universal organizing science. In this fact, the providence of God supporting the Bolsheviks expressed itself. J.V. Stalin was accurate in his selection of the title Economic Problems of Socialism in the USSR, and not something along the lines of Instruction on the Governance towards the Socialist Economy on the Path to Communism. It is this thematics of unsolved problems that impede the further building of socialism and communism, including the irrelevance of Marxism and technology, which is of chief importance in remarks on economic questions connected with the November 1951 discussion. And it would seem that what J.V. Stalin said in remarks is quite sufficient, if in world understanding, to rely on Marxism. However, after he had already stated his vision of this problematics and his understanding of its essence in remarks, J.V. Stalin twice repeats in his replies to the letter of A.I. Notkin and to the letter of A.V. Sanina and V.G. Venger much of what has already been said by him in remarks. Therefore, if you read Economic Problems of Socialism in the USSR, oriented on developing an understanding of the course of economic processes and governance towards them, then the question inevitably arises: for what? For what purpose did J.V. Stalin include in his collection his answers to these two letters, although in these responses he generally only repeats, often quoting himself, what has already been said by him, seemingly sufficiently clearly, in remarks on economic questions? The answer to this question, however, a question of exceptionally high significance in our days, cannot be obtained either on the basis of Marxism and its limitations, or on the basis of the I-centric, private ownership, capitalist world understanding, and even more so, in the course of considering the text of Economic Problems of Socialism in the USSR outside of history. To answer it, the world understanding must go beyond the limits of Marxism, since on the basis of the elite, Marxist, esoteric world understanding, the problems about which J.V. Stalin writes seem to be divorced from real economic life, significant only for the system of propaganda, as a system of suppression of the psyche and political will of members of society with one or another opinion, which is the basis of the power of the governing oligarchy in any crowd elitism. And on the basis of the world understanding of the crowd sincerely believing in Marxism, these same problems seem to have been solved by the great and wise leader and teacher of the Soviet people, J.V. Stalin. From the standpoint of the I-centric worldview and world understanding of private ownership, capitalist entrepreneurship, what J.V. Stalin writes about as problems can be perceived precisely as an expression of capitulationism and of the impossibility of realization in life of the ideals of socialism, and, in the future, of communism. Stalin's warning about the danger of capitulationism at the October 1952 plenum of the Central Committee correlates with this possibility of nravious ethical unpreparedness to resolve these problems. However, Without the development of worldview and world understanding, the actual economic problems of socialism, the problems of organizing governance and self-governance in their essence within the national economy, cannot be resolved. This was confirmed by the subsequent history of the USSR and the post-Soviet states on its territory, including Russia. And we have shown that economic problems of socialism in the USSR contain beacons that allow its thoughtful reader to determine the directionality of the development of his own worldview and world understanding, and correlate with the dominant in society worldview and world understanding, which are automatically reproduced by culture and the noosphere egregorially in the continuity of generations. Furthermore, to obtain an answer to the posed question, it is necessary to return to the historical reality of the 1930s, early 1950s. J.V. Stalin definitely and substantively knew that capitalism in the United States was no longer the free market capitalism of the element of private entrepreneurship in the sphere of production and trade, which, without going into consideration of the activities of the banking system and stock exchanges, was described by Karl Marx in Capital and F. Engels in Anti-Düring. And he knew that it was not the state monopolistic capitalism that Lenin attempted to describe in his work, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. In particular, the United States came out of the Great Depression after the stock market crash in 1929, not on the basis of free private entrepreneurship and the activity of the mechanism of market self-regulation, but on the basis of restrictions on freedom of market self-regulation in the process of organization under the leadership of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, 30th of January 1882, 12th of April 1945, of state regulation of their multi-sectoral production-consumption system. On this state-planned basis, during the Second World War, the U.S. system of production provided not only the needs of its population, without especially impinging on its usual, peaceful way of life, and the needs of its armed forces, which waged a brutal and investment-heavy war against Japan for the Pacific Ocean, but, along with this, also ensured the supply of all military technology, industrial equipment, food, vehicles to the Allies in the anti-Hitler coalition. For the United States, the war, in terms of damage inflicted, was not so much bloody and costly as investment-heavy. Over the entire period of the war, their armed forces lost about 500,000 people, and there was no destruction on the territory of the United States itself. One of the indicators of the investment heaviness of the war is the US Navy, with which they ended the war. It became then the most powerful in the world, and almost all of it, including dozens of heavy ships, battleships and aircraft carriers, and several hundred light ships, cruisers, destroyers, escort aircraft carriers, and many ships and vessels for other purposes, was built during the war in 3.5 years after 1941. Shipbuilding programs of this kind, including the development of production capacity for the industries serving shipbuilding, were usually carried out in peacetime over several decades. As a consequence of the peculiarities of the geographic location of the United States and the character of its participation in the war, the production capacity of its national economy increased significantly during the war, which distinguishes it from the other warring countries. In other words, investments in the war paid off with relatively small irrecoverable losses in relation to their population, 500,000 from a population of 150 million, while in Belarus losses amounted to about 2 million deaths from a population of 8 million. US spending on the Lend-Lease Act from March the 11th, 1941 to August the 1st, 1945 amounted to $46 billion, 13% of all military spending during the war years, and more than 50% of exports, from the share of which $9.8 billion was allocated to the USSR, according to data from the Great Soviet Encyclopedia. And no matter what the propaganda says about the volume of supplies from the US of military equipment in relation to the volume of its own production and the quality of American tanks and aircraft, one must not forget about the Studebaker trucks and some other positions of the types of products consumed in the war, for which deliveries from the US, if not decisive, were significant enough to ease the burden of war on the economy of the USSR. Moreover, during the war, the United States carried out a directive-addressedly governed project of creation of nuclear weaponry, in which, often without knowing it, private and state enterprises of almost all sectors of its economy participated. The same applies to Germany, and in even more striking manifestations. The planned principle of a nationwide scale was one of the factors with the help of which the Hitler regime brought the country out of the economic crisis that began in 1929, in which it found itself as a result of the liberalism, including in the field of economics, of the regime of the Weimar Republic. Without the planned principle of a nationwide scale introduced into the economy by the Hitler regime, it would have been impossible for Germany to either prepare for war with the achieved by her indicators of military economic power, or to resist the Allies in the anti-Hitler coalition, above all the USSR, in the World War for almost 4 years, starting from June 22, 1941. What came before this date can be considered the period in which Germany was being drawn into the war. Therewith, during the war itself, unlike the USSR, Germany, in conditions of a raw material shortage and almost complete foreign trade isolation, not counting robbery by her of enslaved Europe, was forced to develop, to expand production, and adopt new generations of aviation and tank technology, and almost managed to complete the program of re-equipping aviation with jet technology, developed and adopted missile weapons of operational tactical range of 2 types, V-1 cruise missile and V-2 ballistic missile, worked on the creation of intercontinental ballistic missiles, and support for the launch of missiles from submarines, led her own program for the creation of nuclear weapons, the reasons for the delay of which, by the end of the war, is a theme for special research and investigation. These and other well-known facts indicated that the planned principle of a nationwide scale somehow finds a place in the market regulation of capitalist states, at least in the most advanced of them, but without violating the very principles of crowd-elite organization of capitalism. Even from the newspapers at that time, it was possible to learn that after the end of the war in the capitalist countries, an intensive development of the state sector of the economy began, which inevitably led to the creation of a state system of governance towards it. In particular, at the end of the war, Great Britain nationalized a number of industries. The attempt to remove the state-planned principle from the economic activity of society, undertaken by scoundrels and idiots. This is not an emission of negative emotions, but a justified by life characterization of their nravious ethical qualities and intellectual power, became an illustrative example of the fact that the high-tech industries, aerospace, fundamental science, and so forth, are not life-capable without a state-planned principle, especially in conditions of their strangulation by bank usury. As is known, directly in the post-war years, the USSR mastered the scientific technical achievements of the Third Reich and the United States. They copied the American B-29 bomber, a carrier of nuclear weapons, studied and mastered in production their samples of electronic techniques for various purposes. The Soviet nuclear project was carried out, among other things, on the basis of the study of American developments, which became available thanks to the activities of intelligence and of L.P. Beria personally. The first engines of the Soviet post-war jet aircraft were copied and modified from captured German samples. Although the creator of the German V missiles, Wernher von Braun, settled in the US after the war and continued to work there, some of his developments ended up in the USSR. The German weapons testing area and the main plant were located in Poland and were studied when creating Soviet missiles. Products of peaceful and household use of foreign developers were copied and mastered in production. Moreover, it was clear to many that the appearance of all this and much more, in some cases outstripping by a decade the achievements of the Allies in the anti-Hitler coalition in Germany during the war, in the conditions of the termination of the exchange of scientific technical information with other states, in conditions of a raw material shortage and foreign trade isolation, in the conditions of a brain drain. Many scientists and engineers, one way or the other, connected with Jewry, emigrated from Germany, as well as sabotage in Germany and in the subordinate to her Europe, organized by opponents of the Hitler regime, that all this is the result not only of the fact that the Nazi regime relied on traditional German culture, which for several centuries encouraged education, training, invention, and conscientious diligence in labor, but was also the result of the fact that the system of state governance of the Third Reich provided a very high quality of governance towards diverse resources, including the identification and use of heterogeneous creative potential of the population of the Third Reich. And although this system of governance towards the economy and its self-regulation created by the Nazi regime was turned by it into evil, it was a very effective production-distribution system, which, under different political leadership, would have worked no less effectively for the realization of different objectives. Its effectiveness was ensured by a combination of the state-planned principle in determining the range of production and the distribution of resources between projects in the first place and sectors in the second place, with the activity of the market mechanism that ensured the maximum degree of self-sufficiency of enterprises by reducing production costs and expenses. We have provided an evaluation of the quality of governance towards macroeconomic systems of developed capitalist states in the 1930s, 1940s, according to well-known facts that characterize them integrally. However, it must be remembered, several Soviet intelligence agencies were also involved in detailed coverage and analysis of global political and economic processes and the situation in foreign countries. Analysts of all such services of a sufficiently high level are always free from the dominant in their societies cultivated ideologies or public opinions, which in some cases they themselves form. And therefore, in the internal kitchen of the special services, themes are always touched upon in one way or the other that aren't subject to unpunished discussion in their societies. And therewith, things are called by their proper names, as far as the terminological apparatus mastered by the society and the special services and the self-censorship of crowd elitism allows. It is another matter whether their opinions are expressed in public politics and how they are expressed. Among the special services operating in the USSR, there were special services and branches of the special services that worked for J.V. Stalin personally. Therefore, J.V. Stalin knew the facts, read analytical reviews, which reached him through the system of self-censorship of the special services and the system of apparatus guardianship in relation to him, from which it clearly followed that the state-planned principle penetrates into the governance towards the economy of developed capitalist states, while preserving in them the activity of market mechanisms of self-regulation of the economy, thereby increasing in them the productivity of social labor and the stability of the capitalist system as a whole, without burdening the system of production and distribution of products with a super-proportional growth of the bureaucratic stratum. We are not trying in hindsight to present J.V. Stalin as more intelligent and more far-sighted than he really was, but on the issue of introducing the planned principle of a state-wide scale into the economy of capitalism, J.V. Stalin did write. In Economic Problems of Socialism in the USSR, we read the following. Coalescence of the monopolies with the state machine. The word coalescence is not appropriate. It superficially and descriptively notes the process of merging of the monopolies with the state, but it does not reveal the economic import of this process. The fact of the matter is that the merging process is not simply a process of coalescence, but the subjugation of the state machine to the monopolies. The word coalescence should, therefore, be discarded and replaced by the words subjugation of the state machine to the monopolies. It would seem that J.V. Stalin says nothing in the given fragment about planning on a statewide scale under capitalism. But the question arises, what happens in the process of the so-called merging of monopolies with the state, or rather, in the process of subjugation of the state machine to the monopolies? If we, substantively according to its essence, imagine the activities of directorates of monopolistic associations and the state apparatus, then the answer to this question is simple. The planned principle, the culture of planning of the development and organization of production, planning and organization of the development of new types of products, which has developed within the boundaries of intra-sectoral monopolies and multi-sectoral concerns of capitalist society, having exhausted its possibilities for increasing profits of capitalists, begins to master a new area of activity for itself, planning and organization of production on a state and trans-state scale, as a result of which the directorates of monopolies are forced, by all means available to them, to subordinate the state apparatus, which in turn is forced, under pressure from the directorates of monopolies, to organize economic planning on a statewide scale in the interests of monopolies, or rather, in the interests of the capitalists, the owners of these monopolies. And now this process has gone so far that states, under pressure from transnational monopolies, create transnational planning bodies, IMF, World Bank, and so forth, increasingly abandoning their sovereignty in the field of national economic politics and finance, but preferring in doing so to avoid the very term planning, so as not to put many private entrepreneurs and ordinary people before the question of how the enforcement of plans and control over their implementation on a global scale is carried out, and for what goals it is objectively done. And with these external economic circumstances manifested in the developed capitalist countries, J.V. Stalin correlated the Soviet socio-economic reality and thought about the prospects. By the early 1950s, the multi-sectoral production-consumption system of the USSR had been, as a whole, it would be foolish to deny mistakes and abuses, but they were of a limited character, as a consequence of which the Bolshevik state, the first in the history of the current global civilization, did not collapse, successfully developing for a quarter of a century, and governance towards it was sufficiently effective in order to do the following. Prepare the USSR for victory in the war. Be victorious in the Great Patriotic War, which proceeded according to one of the most difficult scenarios out of many possible. Restore, in the course of the first post-war 5-year plan, that which had been destroyed by the war, and liquidate the US nuclear monopoly. Reach the first place in the world, according to indicators of the educational level of its population. And this was possible because the pace of socio-economic development of the USSR during the years of Stalinist Bolshevism, even with the sabotage and subversion that took place throughout this era by opponents of building socialism, were the highest in the world. As a result, the rationing system for distribution of products was abolished in the USSR earlier than in the other warring countries of Europe. The USSR rebuilt what was destroyed in the war earlier than the other countries of Europe, as well as the former allies of the USSR at the time. Hoped that it would take more than 20 years to restore what had been destroyed in the USSR. Despite the fact that the European states, in the restoration of their economies, continued to receive aid from the US on the basis of the Marshall Plan, and the USSR was conducting the restoration of the national economy on its own, in addition, providing all possible assistance to other states that had chosen the socialist path of development. It is enough to consider the assistance to the peoples of China in primary industrialization and the creation of scientific technical schools. Moreover, by the beginning of the 1950s, the demographically conditioned spectra of production and consumption had reached in the USSR the level of minimum sufficiency. Education was available to everyone, including higher education. Medical care, high level according to the world standards of those years, was available. Everyone was well fed, dressed, there were no homeless and unemployed, there was no class of people living from the garbage. There was free time for recreation and personal development. The range of supply and quality of mass-produced products, although they did not correspond to the elitarian consumer standards of developed capitalist countries, were generally higher than the average standards of most of them, and higher than the standards of 1913, still remembered by the population of the USSR, and did not cause any particular complaints from the population of the USSR. The level of social protection of the individual was qualitatively higher than in any of the capitalist countries. However, the further growth of the range of production and consumption in qualitative and quantitative terms was in many respects problematic as a consequence of the fact that the national economy of the country was governed solely on the basis of personal address distribution of both directive and reporting control information. Herewith, as a consequence of the elitization of governors' professionals, largely conditioned by the impact of the noosphere and culture, although it would be wrong to write everything off to automatic impact of the noosphere and culture, inherited from the past, the objectives of ensuring personal and family well-being of officials supplanted in the motivation of their behavior the objectives corresponding to social interest in the performance of their official duties. In the words of V.I. Lenin, they were very far removed from the people. As a consequence of the orientation towards the satisfaction of their selfish, momentary interests, the core of governors' professionals, becoming elitized, gradually lost understanding of the essence of those things that were becoming alien to it, technological, organizational, and processes of social life in general that were under its governance. As a result of the decline in the qualifications of governors and the need to ensure governance, it grew, numerically outstripping the growth of production, and gradually turned into a mafia stratum of mentally impotent bureaucrats, parasitizing on the process of governance and the life of society. This equally characterizes both the bureaucracy of the party apparatus and the bureaucracy of all other branches of society, statehood, business executives, education and science, etc. Science, fundamental and applied, including design development works, also became in the USSR a sphere of clan mafia, bureaucratic activity, and this also did not bode well for the future. The danger of clan mafia bureaucratic degeneration of science was also pointed out by Stalin directly. Question: did Pravda act rightly in starting an open discussion on problems of linguistics? Yes, it did. Along what lines the problems of linguistics will be settled will become clear at the conclusion of the discussion. But it may be said already that the discussion has been very useful. It has brought out, in the first place, that in linguistic bodies, both in the center and in the republics, a regime has prevailed, which is alien to science and men of science. The slightest criticism of the state of affairs in Soviet linguistics, even the most timid attempt to criticize the so-called new doctrine in linguistics, was persecuted and suppressed by the leading linguistic circles. Valuable workers and researchers in linguistics were dismissed from their posts or demoted for being critical of N.Y. Mar's heritage or expressing the slightest disapproval of his teachings. Linguistic scholars were appointed to leading posts not on their merits, but because of their unqualified acceptance of N.Y. Mar's theories. It is generally recognized that no science can develop and flourish without a battle of opinions, without freedom of criticism. But this generally recognized rule was ignored and flouted in the most unceremonious fashion. There arose a close group of infallible leaders who, having secured themselves against any possible criticism, became a law unto themselves and did whatever they pleased. That is, it would be a lie to assert that J.V. Stalin was in a state of self-delight from what had been achieved both by the state that he governed and society as a whole, as well as from what had been achieved by him personally in the growth of his career. It would be a lie to assert that he did not see the problem of governorial inconsistency, of the growing and bourgeois degenerating party and other bureaucracy, and did not search for a means and ways to resolve this problem. J.V. Stalin was not satisfied with the anti-communist tendencies that were gaining strength in the country, with his personal position, or with the supporters who belonged to a parasitically degenerated and governorially inconsistent bureaucracy. In addition, from the mid-1920s to the end of the 1930s, L.D. Trotsky publicly blamed him for the bureaucratization of life in the USSR, and no matter how negatively J.V. Stalin viewed Marxism as a whole, being well read in Marxist literature, he knew that in his definition of bureaucracy as a phenomenon in the life of a crowd elite society, Karl Marx was correct. However, except for the last phrase in Karl Marx's definition of this term of sociology, which we cite below. The bureaucracy is a circle from which no one can escape. Its hierarchy is a hierarchy of knowledge. The highest point entrusts the understanding of particulars to the lower echelons, whereas these, on the other hand, credit the highest with an understanding in regard to the universal, and thus they deceive one another. The general spirit of the bureaucracy is the secret, the mystery, preserved inwardly by means of the hierarchy and externally, in relation to society, as a closed corporation. To make public the mind and the disposition of the state appears therefore to the bureaucracy as a betrayal of its mystery. Accordingly, authority is the principle of its knowledge and being, and the deification of authority is its mentality. So Karl Marx explained ahead of time who created the personality cult of J.V. Stalin within Soviet society, for what reasons and for what objectives it was created. As far as the individual bureaucrat is concerned, the end of the state becomes his private end, a pursuit of higher posts, the building of a career. However, concerning the individually considered bureaucrat, Karl Marx's opinion on this question is false. In reality, the opposite is true. It is not the end of the state which becomes the private end of the bureaucrat, which any statehood could only dream of, but his own personal or family clan end. In fact, many bureaucrats are under the thumb, or poor cousins, in the clans that have adopted them, possessing a position in this or that sphere of life of society. The bureaucrat strives to elevate this end to a statewide rank, to present it in the quality of a statewide end, and if this is impossible or fails, then to do his vile business in secret from society. On the basis of the aspiration for this, the bureaucracy is actually formed as a mafia corporation, a circle from which no one can escape alone, and so on in the text of Karl Marx, excluding his rejected by us opinion about the essence of the activity of the individual bureaucrat, which distorts the idea about bureaucracy as a phenomenon in the life of a crowd elite society. Including and in accordance with this warning, anticipating events, J.V. Stalin knew that the bureaucracy was not capable of ensuring the governance towards production and distribution of products within society in concordance with the needs of building socialism and communism. And in accordance with this, he saw in it, as a whole and in every individual bureaucrat, the enemy of the ideas and cause which he sincerely served. However, to the Soviet bureaucracy of the 1920s, 1930s, there is something to be grateful for. This thoughtless and will-less monster, whom J.V. Stalin was able to ride, turned out to be quite suitable for the suppression of the open, pseudo-democratic mafia omnipotence of Marxist psycho-Trotskyism in the 1920s, 1930s. But by the end of the 1940s, it had already become an obstacle to the further development of the USSR. The correctness of this warning was revealed even in the course of the Great Patriotic War, but one shouldn't change horses midstream, besides in exceptional cases. Accordingly, the highest ranks of the Air Force and aviation industry were brought to justice after the war for malfeasance in office during the war years. By mutual conspiracy of high-ranking officials of both departments of the Air Force, they received obviously defective aviation equipment from the aviation industry, as a result of which there occurred many aviation accidents and disasters in which, outside of combat, the pilots were injured and wounded, or perished. Although this episode from the history of the USSR in recent years has been presented by the mass media as an example of the allegedly unjustified repressions that took place in the post-war years, nonetheless, this is not the only case of the bureaucracy's manifestation of its anti-people essence. It simply became one of the most famous of many such cases of the Soviet era, accompanying the bureaucratic style of governance towards development and production of products throughout the post-Petrine history of Russia to the present. The lapses committed by the Soviet bureaucrats in the field of governance towards the national economy are also mentioned in Economic Problems of Socialism in the USSR, which will be discussed further on. Accordingly, in order to not again find themselves in the yoke of a global biblical or any other oligarchy of pseudo-Zhrezes, the peoples of the USSR really needed to start solving the problems of socialism, the construction of which had not yet been fully completed. And in life, there is a certain correspondence in the system, objectives, problems that need to be resolved on the path to realization of objectives. In other words, certain objectives, certain problems, other objectives, other problems. The objectives of the following stage of social development of the USSR, J.V. Stalin, in Economic Problems of Socialism in the USSR, indicated quite definitely and precisely. It is necessary, in the third place, to ensure such a cultural advancement of society as will secure, for all members of society, the all-round development of their physical and mental abilities, so that the members of society may be in a position to receive an education sufficient to enable them to be active agents of social development. To be active agents of social development, this implies the conceptual powerfulness of the common people, of the lower classes, in the terms of crowd elitism, and the unconditional subordination of this power to the statehood. Despots and tyrants, power lovers, do not call for such things. And in a position freely to choose their occupations and not be tied all their lives, owing to the existing division of labor, to some one occupation. What is required for this? It would be wrong to think that such a substantial advance in the cultural standard of the members of society can be brought about without substantial changes in the present status of labor. For this, it is necessary, first of all, to shorten the working day at least to 6 and subsequently to 5 hours. This is needed in order that members of society might have the necessary free time to receive an all-round education. It is necessary, further, to introduce universal, compulsory, polytechnical education, which is required in order that members of society might be able freely to choose their occupations and not be tied to some one occupation all their lives. It is likewise necessary that housing conditions should be radically improved, and that real wages of workers and employees should be at least doubled, if not more, both by means of direct increases of wages and salaries, and, more especially, by further systematic reductions of prices for consumer goods. These are the basic conditions required to pave the way for the transition to communism. J.V. Stalin proved in practice that the macroeconomy of the state can work stably in a mode of systematic, planned regular reduction of prices. After the abolition of the rationing system in 1947, prices were reduced annually, which reflected an undeniable growth in the productivity of social labor. As a result of this policy, the well-being of all grew, and not predominantly the well-being of those who know how to settle into the groove, and those who live not only off one salary, with a wide margin from the indicators of the rest of society. The world behind the scenes and its henchmen, financial and stock exchange tycoons, and the sociological science and the fed-by-them journalists, also cannot forgive Stalin for this. On the other hand, the current Russian opposition are either fools or, in the end, have become frightened, and therefore do not dare to confront the regime with the demand, "Long live the Stalinist policy of systematic, planned regular reduction of prices." From this it can be understood that the national economy of the USSR was meant to work not at all to fill the belly of the townsfolk, flood them with beer, vodka, shower them with clothes, and, by reducing the working day, provide time for those no less stupefying than alcohol and other drugs, perversions of sexual promiscuity, contributing to the flourishing of the porn industry, gambling, and show business. It was meant to work not so that there would emerge a new, luxuriating elite of highly cultured, salon, parasites idlers, divorced from life, for whom everyone else would have toiled like mules. This is a life-consistent alternative to the self-destructive way of survival, and not of life, of civilization, which the developed capitalist countries achieved from 1952, having ruined the backward countries. The national economy was meant to work to free up for all people the free time that they needed in order to deeply feel, realize, and understand themselves, to master their potential of personal development, in order to help children and grandchildren in the mastering of their potential of personal development, in order that people might become active practitioners in social development. In other words, if this transition point of socio-economic development, indicated by J.V. Stalin back in the middle of the 20th century, had been achieved, then, during the period of entry into life of 2 to 3 generations, i.e. over the course of approximately 70 years, there could have taken place the birth of a new human and his civilization, in comparison with which all current regional civilizations and global civilization as a whole would have appeared in their true form. Subhuman savagery and anti-human demonism, underdevelopment and perversion of nerves and of the essence of the personality of man. Had this transformation been completed, it would have excluded the very possibility of any tyranny in relation to this society and any of its members. As a consequence of this, the world behind the scenes did everything possible in order to ensure that this transition point was not only not reached, but that almost everyone, as far as possible, would forget about it, and that the crowd elite society of the USSR would slip from the heights to which it had risen under the leadership of J.V. Stalin. If J.V. Stalin had not written Economic Problems of Socialism in the USSR, in which he killed Marxism and pointed out an inconsistent-to-life prospect of development, if he had not spoken out at the October 1952 plenum of the Central Committee against the elitization of the apparatus, then the world behind the scenes would have introduced his name into history as the name of an outstanding Marxist communist, and would have begun to spread the positive developments of the USSR in the field of reining in the consumption race to the developed capitalist countries. In this case, Stalin, in his essence, would not have been. Instead, there would have been another, more successful than L.D. Bronstein, Trotsky in spirit, in the organization of the psyche, including raviousness. However, since all the developments were associated with the name and political will of J.V. Stalin, the world behind the scenes was forced to take up the eradication from society of the spirit of Stalinist Bolshevism. The world behind the scenes, in an attempt to write off the Geschäft on Stalin, miscalculated. Yes, they wrote it off, but thanks to the activities of J.V. Stalin, the Geschäft became national property, and, together with Stalin, dissolved into the future, in which there is no place for the world behind the scenes. For this eradication of the spirit of Stalinist Bolshevism, the periphery of the world behind the scenes suppressed and perverted the processes that began in the era of Stalin's Bolshevism. Although Stalin marked the earlier quoted passages with the words "in the third place" as a consequence of the fact that he lived in a society in which the materialistic world understanding prevailed, and, as now, many thought then that something else was more significant than cultural growth and the personal development of people, nonetheless, this "in the third place" is preceded by two more conditions, which, in the conditions of the dominance of the materialistic world understanding, are a guarantee of the realizability of this very "in the third place." It is necessary, in the first place, to ensure not a mythical, rational organization of the productive forces, but a continuous expansion of all social production, with a relatively higher rate of expansion of the production of means of production. The relatively higher rate of expansion of production of means of production is necessary not only because it has to provide the equipment, both for its own plants and for all the other branches of the national economy, but also because reproduction on an extended scale becomes altogether impossible without it. It is necessary, in the second place, by means of gradual transitions carried out to the advantage of the collective farms, and hence of all society, to raise collective farm property to the level of public property, and also by means of gradual transitions to replace commodity circulation by a system of products exchange, under which the central government or some other social economic center might control the whole product of social production in the interests of society. The first in its essence means that it is necessary, in a short time by historical standards, to create a production technological base, which, with a working day of no more than 5 hours, allows guaranteed satisfaction of all demographically conditioned needs of society, including with the growth of culturally conditioned needs of people, as it is presupposed by the basic economic law of socialism in its formulation by J.V. Stalin. The creation of this production base requires the development and improvement of new generations of means of production, the production of which, to replace obsolete means of production, must be maintained at a sufficiently high level, so that new, effective equipment, organization of works and technologies would predominate in production in all sectors of the national economy. Accordingly, the production of the latest effective means of production should prevail over the production of products of final consumption. The second, in its essence, means that this process should be accompanied and ensured by the creation of a state-wide system for governing the development, production, and distribution of products. Since without such a system of governance, the shift to a new transition point of social development, indicated by Stalin, is unrealizable. According to these three circumstances, the enemies of the people, hiding behind the feeble-minded in relation to the positions held careerists, and the susceptible to pressure clever men of the minute, under the guise of a struggle against the cult of the personality of Stalin, which they themselves had previously created and supported, they began to fight the impact of the ideas of Stalinist Bolshevism on the world understanding of people, for which they removed all works of J.V. Stalin from libraries and political studies, including Economic Problems of Socialism in the USSR, and launched a smear campaign against both Joseph Stalin personally and the entire era of Stalinist Bolshevism. Supported the bureaucratic mafia in science and design and engineering activities, and encouraged it to persecute and corrupt creatively gifted people, to suppress pioneering developments, to refuse to implement them, to waste resources and intellectual potential in dead-end areas. This is why, being the owner of many inventions recognized all over the world and used outside its borders, and moreover of applications rejected by its patent service, which Japan was ready to buy in bulk, the USSR at the beginning of the 1980s had one of the most backward production facilities in the world. Hindered the organization of effective systems of social governance in all spheres of activity. For what purpose? In the thematics of the courses of higher education, of the majority of institutions of higher education, the subjects such as dynamic programming, linear and nonlinear programming, automatic control theory, since there was no other more general theory, which are unknown to the vast majority of graduates of universities in the USSR and the Russian Federation, subjects on the basis of which, in the course of study, a general understanding of the processes of governance in life could be formed, which would allow them to solve specific practical problems in the fields of technology, agriculture, science, and politics as tasks of governance. These subjects were not allowed. Continued to put pressure on the psyche of the population, and, above all, of the younger generations, with the cult of Marxism, thereby perverting the world understanding of people and the views of life prevailing in society. Neither the crowd elite party, nor the crowd elite society of the USSR as a whole, gave this perversion of the course of building of communism a proper rebuff, as a result of which, the economic and related problems of socialism in the USSR were not only unresolved, but new problems and corpses of previously resolved problems resurrected from the dead were added to them. However, they will have to be identified and resolved in any case, because in the highest predestination there is no place for a civilization of speaking humanoid intelligent apes and their demonic masters and higher-ups. Therefore, let us return to what J.V. Stalin saw as the indisputable achievements of socialism, and how he understood the problems that needed to be resolved. J.V. Stalin considered the national economy of the USSR as a systemic integrity, that is, as an object of governance formed by a set of functionally different elements interacting with one another. The development of this multi-sectoral production-consumption system appeared to him as the development and renewal of its element base, as well as the development and renewal of the system of interconnections between its elements. Everyone can be convinced that this is exactly the case by delving into the text of Economic Problems of Socialism in the USSR. Moreover, the functioning of this systemic integrity had to be stably subordinate to certain laws that form a hierarchy of mutual nesting. The first in importance within it should be the basic economic law of socialism. the securing of maximum satisfaction of the constantly rising material and cultural requirements of the whole society through the continuous expansion and perfection of socialist production on the basis of higher techniques. In its formulation by J.V. Stalin. It, in turn, should be subject to the law of planned proportional development of the national economy, understanding the meaning of the words planned and proportionality. Explaining the interrelationship of the economic laws of socialism with each other and their interconnection with life, J.V. Stalin drew attention to the fact that, in contrast to the operation of the law of value under the elemental market capitalism, the economic laws of socialism do not have such automation of activity, but they require cognition, and it is only on this basis that effective planning and governance towards the national economy becomes possible in accordance with them and social needs as such. In particular, that means that the law of balanced development of the national economy makes it possible for our planning bodies to plan social production correctly. But possibility must not be confused with actuality. They are two different things. In order to turn the possibility into actuality, it is necessary to study this economic law, to master it, to learn to apply it with full understanding, and to compile such plans as fully reflect the requirements of this law. It cannot be said that the requirements of this economic law are fully reflected by our yearly and 5-yearly plans. Contrary to the belief of many that J.V. Stalin did not attach any significance to the law of value as a set of objective indicators of economic efficiency, cost of production, market prices, and profitability, as a result of which the national economy of the USSR was extremely ineffective, this is absolutely not so. J.V. Stalin attached special significance to the law of value, which he considered unattainable in the conditions of capitalist economy. However, scientists, economists, and, above all, titled fools from the economic department of the Academy of Sciences of the USSR and the Union Republics, and the current Russian Academy of Sciences, throughout the years since the release into the world of Economic Problems of Socialism in the USSR, either could not or did not wish to understand either what J.V. Stalin had written, or what in real life resides behind the accounting entries in the process of economic activity. About the law of value, J.V. Stalin wrote literally the following: "The sphere of operation of the law of value is limited by the social ownership of the means of production, and by the law of balanced development of the national economy, and is consequently also limited by our yearly and 5-yearly plans, which are an approximate reflection of the requirements of this law." What is significant here is that J.V. Stalin, speaking precisely about an approximate reflection of the objective law, recognized the inevitability of errors conditioned by various reasons that are inherent in every plan, as a result of which the exact execution of the plan is not the best, from the multitude objectively possible, way of using the production capacity of the national economy. Some comrades draw the conclusion from this that the law of balanced development of the national economy and economic planning annul the principle of profitableness of production. This is quite untrue. It is just the other way around. If profitableness is considered not from the standpoint of individual plants or industries, and not over a period of 1 year, but from the standpoint of the entire national economy and over a period of, say, 10 or 15 years, which is the only correct approach to the question, then the temporary and unstable profitableness of some plants or industries is beneath all comparison with that higher form of stable and permanent profitableness which we get from the operation of the law of balanced development of the national economy and from economic planning, which save us from periodical economic crises disruptive to the national economy, and causing tremendous material damage to society, and which ensure the continuous and high-rate expansion of our national economy. When speaking in my remarks of the profitableness of the socialist national economy, I was controverting certain comrades who alleged that by not giving great preference to profitable enterprises, and by tolerating the existence side by side with them of unprofitable enterprises, our planned economy is killing the very principle of profitableness of economic undertakings. The remarks say that profitableness considered from the standpoint of individual plants or industries is beneath all comparison with that higher form of profitableness which we get from our socialist mode of production, which saves us from the crises of overproduction and ensures us a continuous expansion of production. But it would also be mistaken to conclude from this that the profitableness of individual plants and industries is of no particular value and is not deserving of serious attention. That, of course, is not true. The profitableness of individual plants and industries is of immense value for the development of our industry. It must be taken into account both when planning construction and when planning production. It is an elementary requirement of our economic activity at the present stage of development. Therewith, J.V. Stalin directly provides a caveat. There can be no doubt that under our present socialist conditions of production, the law of value cannot be a regulator of proportions of labor distributed among the various branches of production. This function, regulation of intersectoral proportions, should be carried by the basic economic law of socialism, from which the setting of objectives for the system of production stems, and the law of planned, proportional development of the national economy, which opens up the possibility of ensuring the best correspondence of production possibilities to the needs of society for products. But this raises the question of how the highest profitability of the national economy as a whole correlates with the profitability of each of the sectors, and, in essence, with the profitability of a number of enterprises in these sectors, moreover, belonging to various forms of ownership: state, cooperative, collective farm, possibly sole proprietor. If everything is clear with the profitability of any enterprise, the income from the sale of its products should normally be greater than its expenses in the process of producing these products, since otherwise the enterprise requires subsidies. Then what is the profitability of the national economy as an integral system in the time interval of 10 to 15 years? Many do not understand. Many don't understand, first of all, because the socialist state is not one of the many users of the credit financial system, but its owner. In addition, the state, as the owner of the credit financial system and a number of enterprises, does not receive financial profit and does not suffer losses if some values from the balance sheet of one enterprise are transferred to the balance sheet of another enterprise, which is accompanied by a corresponding transfer of amounts from the account of the second enterprise to the account of the first one. In reality, everything is not as complicated as it might seem to some. The gross range of production at any given time interval can be univocally estimated both at cost price and at actual prices. Accordingly, in the same time interval, the cost of a newly put into operation means of production, including the equipment of the system of distribution of products, ensuring the storage and sale of products to its final consumers, can be estimated in its composition. Over time, these means of production will produce the goods that the consumer will receive. It does not matter how the consumer will pay for these products, what the prices will be for them, when considering the issue of the profitability of the national economy as an integrity. What matters is something else. If the national economy as a whole is profitable over a certain time interval, then the value of the range of production obtained as a result of the introduction of new means of production in all sectors, in constant prices, prime costs at the beginning of the period should be higher than the value of these means of production. Naturally, the shorter the period during which the newly introduced means of production are compensated by the goods produced by them, the more efficient they are, and the higher the profitability of the national economy as an integral system is. And at the same time, the production of means of production that are superior in efficiency to those previously produced should be of a predominant character in relation to the production of products of final consumption. This is the guarantee of the stability of the described mode of functioning of the national economy in the successive sequence of the planned production cycles under consideration, the intervals for monitoring system-wide profitability. The profitability of the national economy with this approach is evaluated by the activities of exclusively the production sector, with the inclusion of the system of delivery of products to the final consumer. Everything that is not directly related to the production and distribution of products is excluded from the evaluation of the profitability of the national economy as an integral system, since the very possibility of the activity of other sectors of the economy is conditioned by the ability of the production-distribution sector to feed and equip the life of those employed in other sectors. With this approach, scientific, technical, and organizational technological progress goes into the margin of stability of evaluating the profitability of the national economy. And the speculative sector of the economy, engaged in the extraction of income from securities and the resale of products produced by others, is excluded from consideration as parasitic. This is the general approach. In practice, it should be implemented on the basis of a determined, classified nomenclature of products, including services, lying at the basis of planning, accounting for production and distribution of products, their actual consumption, which, the nomenclature, should ensure the comparability of indicators at the beginning and end of the control period. Otherwise, the non-determinateness of the classified nomenclature, significant changes to it in the considered time interval, exclude the comparability of indicators. The division of the national economy into sectors and the classification of sectors are of a secondary character in relation to the classified nomenclature of products, as a consequence of the fact that the composition of sectors and the character of their interconnections over long intervals of time inevitably changes under the impact of scientific, technical, and organizational technological progress. In other words, the system of long-term strategic planning of production, distribution, consumption, and utilization of products can and should be a derivative of a stable nomenclature of a demographically conditioned spectrum of needs, and not a consequence of an unstable nomenclature of sectors. The duration of the period for the evaluation of the profitability of the national economy as a whole was defined by J.V. Stalin as 10 to 15 years. This means that within 10 to 15 years, practically all investments should normally pay off, in the sense of the just described approach, thereby ensuring the profitability of the national economy as a whole, calculated in constant prices. Furthermore, in essence, by his formulation of the principle of the highest profitability of the national economy, J.V. Stalin implicitly laid down the requirements for planning to ensure, every 10 to 15 years, a qualitative update of the entire technical, technological, and correspondingly organizational base of the national economy as an integral production-consumption system. This does not mean that the national economy cannot have more long-lived equipment and infrastructures and projects with longer payback periods, or planned unprofitable, but socially necessary projects, which means that more efficient equipment and technologies than existing ones should be introduced en masse in all industries, and so it should be in the successive sequence of the planned production cycles. The foregoing shows that Stalin did not expect any long-term construction during which the project manages to become obsolete and lose the meaning of its implementation, and the structures and equipment being built begin to collapse. This kind of long-term construction, which later became the norm, is a perversion of the Byabakovites in the Khrushchev-Brezhnev-era State Planning Committee of the USSR and the Republics. But everything said by J.V. Stalin about the order of subordination of the law of value to the principle of highest profitableness of the national economy at intervals of 10 to 15 years, with the subordination of the multi-sectoral production-consumption system to the basic economic law of socialism and the law of planned proportional development of the national economy, is the setting of two interconnected tasks. The first, maintaining in the national economy the tax-subsidized balance, i.e., ensuring the financial stability of planned unprofitable and low-profitable enterprises by means of redistribution of the superprofits of highly profitable enterprises and sectors in favor of planned unprofitable and low-profitable ones. The second, using the above planned production capacities, which, firstly, are inevitably present in the system as a consequence of accounting errors and the need to ensure the margin of stability of the plan for the resources and capacities involved in production, and secondly, which are newly emerging as a result of scientific, technical, and organizational technological progress in the process of fulfilling state planning targets. These two interconnected tasks should be set in such a way that the products that can be produced by them would find a consumer and would be useful to society. But both of these tasks are unsolvable in the conditions of bureaucratic governance. This is one of the reasons why J.V. Stalin wrote quite correctly, "Under our present socialist conditions of production, the law of value cannot be a regulator of proportions of labor distributed among the various branches of production. The fact is that the bureaucrat, whose duties include governing the tax-subsidy balance, cannot distinguish the loss or low profitability of the enterprise which arose as a result of bad bureaucratic governance towards it and the plundering of socialist property from the loss or low profitability which is a consequence of the state policy of price formation, which pursues in essence non-economic objectives, relying in their achievement on the principle of the highest stable profitability of the national economy as an integral system expressed by J.V. Stalin. As a consequence of this, the bureaucrat, in principle, can maintain the tax-subsidized balance by distributing subsidies in favor of fools and thieves at the expense of the laborers, acting in such a way, quite well-intentionedly, contrary to the principle of the highest profitability of the national economy. In order not to make a mistake, and not to undermine with his mistake the state price-forming policy which pursues objectives that are really incomprehensible to him, but to maintain the tax-subsidized balance, not in general, but in line with the principle of the highest profitability of the national economy, this is above the abilities of a high-ranking bureaucrat. A lower-ranked bureaucrat, whose job it is to govern the enterprise, is no better. He not only does not understand the principle of the highest profitability of the national economy, but this principle is repugnant to him to the very depths of his soul, since his personal and clan objectives replace in his behavior public ones, for which the principle of the highest profitability of the national economy as an integral system is called upon to work. Although this principle guarantees him in the future an improvement in well-being on an equal basis with everyone else, nonetheless, the subordination of the activities of the enterprise to it, that is, the use of resources and production capacities in accordance with it, prevents the bureaucrat from abusing his official position and from enriching himself at the expense of everyone else, both right now and in the future. Likewise, the task of using above-planned capacities is, in the conditions of bureaucratic governance, unsolvable. In essence, the use of above-planned capacities requires the expansion of the area of operation of commodity money exchange in the socialist economy, and the inclusion into this area of enterprises in the state sector of the national economy. This would allow the organization of self-regulation of the use of above-planned production capacities in the national economy at the rate of their identification or freeing from planned works on the initiative of those who directly govern them, eliminating the loss of time in the procedure of putting forward plan proposals by enterprises to the top, agreeing on additional plan tasks, making changes in the already implemented state plan, or would allow the exclusion of idle capacity before their being loaded upon the release of planned products in the next planning period. However, bureaucratic governance excluded such a possibility, since the legalization of the mechanism of market self-regulation in the use of above-planned production capacities, which are factually at the absolute disposal of bureaucrats, heads of enterprises, automatically led to their sabotage of planned tasks. First of all, low cost and planned unprofitable, both deliberate, purpose-oriented, in order to discredit socialism and in order to restore capitalism, and sabotage out of ignorance, pushing for the pursuit of profit. In order to improve the well-being of its own collective, the Yugoslav model of socialism, to the detriment of solving production problems of social as a whole significance. The dominance of the political economy of Marxism excluded the possibility of exposing malicious sabotage and excluding sabotage out of ignorance. This statement needs to be clarified. Stalin writes about the problematics of the indistinctness of the political economy of Marxism in the coverage of such questions. It therefore follows that in the sphere of foreign trade, the means of production produced by our enterprises retain the properties of commodities, both essentially and formally, but that in the sphere of domestic economic circulation, means of production lose the properties of commodities, cease to be commodities, and pass out of the sphere of the operation of the law of value. Because regardless of which enterprise they are located in, they belong to the Soviet state, retaining only the outward integument of commodities, calculation, etc. How is this peculiarity to be explained? If the matter is approached from the formal angle, from the angle of processes taking place on the surface of phenomena, one may arrive at the incorrect conclusion that the categories of capitalism retain their validity under our economy. If, however, the matter is approached from the standpoint of Marxist analysis, which strictly distinguishes between the substance of the economic process and its form, between the deep processes of development and the surface phenomena, one comes to the only correct conclusion, namely, that it is chiefly the form, the outward appearance of the old categories of capitalism that have remained in our country, but that their essence has radically changed in adaptation to the requirements of the development of the socialist economy. If one approaches the matter without constraining oneself with the norms of Marxism, then it is possible to draw only one correct conclusion. The political economy of Marxism calls many things and phenomena by names that are not peculiar to them, as a consequence of which, there arises in the Marxist description a discrepancy between the form of the phenomenon and its content. Coordination of form and content in such situations is of a subjective character. J.V. Stalin, in favor of public property de facto, the planned principle of the statewide scale, the principle of the highest profitability of the national economy as a whole, on the basis of effective governance towards enterprises and prices in accordance with the real, current and future needs of Dobrosovesh's laborers and the needs of the state in products and services. A Soviet bureaucrat, a Marxist dogmatist. in favor of his own benefit, and of the detriment of society, of the detriment of the ideals and cause of communism, and one can't find fault. Everything is justified by communist practicability, expressed in the forms of Marxism, the right to one interpretation or another of which is determined by the position in the hierarchy of mutual subordination of positions. In order to establish the unity of form and content in this kind of non-coincidence between them, arising not only from Marxism, but from any modification of the I-centric world-view and world-understanding, an alternative encompassing sociological theory was needed, in which things and phenomena would be called by their proper names, providing thus the univocal understanding of life by different people. With the development of a theory with such qualities, well-intentioned ignorant bureaucrats, mastering it, would change the organization of their psyche and acquire the correspondence to real life of their subjective views on it, as a result of which they would cease to be bureaucrats and would become governorially consistent professionals, Bolshevik entrepreneurs. A theory with such qualities would allow the overwhelming majority of people to expose, with all the repressive consequences arising from this fact, the malicious, clever men who pursue the objective of destroying the achievements of socialist construction and restoring the legitimized crowd elitism in any of its forms. As a consequence of the totality of these and other unresolved problems, in those socio-historical conditions, J.V. Stalin was right to limit the sphere of commodity money exchange, trade in the sphere of production, by the interaction of the state sector of the economy and the cooperative collective farm sector on the basis of prices set by the state. But even in these conditions, nothing except for bureaucracy and governance towards the cause prevented the increase of the profitability of enterprises in the cooperative collective farm sector in relation to the level attainable on the basis of the planned procurement prices of the state. The same applies to increasing the profitability of state sector enterprises in relation to the level set in the plans. Connected with this is also the question as to why J.V. Stalin writes that the growth of the people's well-being should be ensured in two ways, both by directly raising wages and especially by further systematic reduction of prices for consumer goods. The answer to this question precisely expresses the fact that in a socialist economy, the following two principles should be combined. The first is the principle of the highest profitability of the national economy as a whole, which is expressed in a systematic, planned regular reduction of prices to the measure of growth in the productivity of social labor and the range of production, as well as the needs of people in diverse products, including service. The second is the principle of achieving the highest degree of self-sufficiency of enterprises, as a consequence of which savings in the production of a unit of accounting and above planned production should be expressed not only in a decrease in prices and an increase in production rates, but in an increase in the nominal income of enterprises, which makes it possible to increase their collectives of public consumption funds and reward their own laborers, thereby directly stimulating Dobrosovesh's labor without waiting for the next statewide price reduction. The fact that in post-Stalinist times the strategy was perverted does not at all mean that J.V. Stalin was mistaken in his ideas about the interconnection between the planned principle of a statewide scale and the principles of self-sufficiency, profitability, of both individual enterprises and the national economy as a whole. Stalin explains the issue of commodity production under socialism, and accordingly the issue of the functioning of the market, as follows. Commodity production must not be regarded as something sufficient unto itself, something independent of the surrounding economic conditions. Commodity production is older than capitalist production. It existed in slave-owning society and served it, but did not lead to capitalism. It existed in feudal society and served it, yet, although it prepared some of the conditions for capitalist production, it did not lead to capitalism. Why then, one asks, cannot commodity production similarly serve our socialist society for a certain period without leading to capitalism? Bearing in mind that in our country, commodity production is not so boundless and all-embracing as it is under capitalist conditions, being confined within strict bounds, thanks to such decisive economic conditions as social ownership of the means of production, the abolition of the system of wage labor, and the elimination of the system of exploitation. Of course, when instead of two basic production sectors, the state sector and the collective farm sector, there will be only one all-embracing production sector with the right to dispose of all the consumer goods produced in the country, commodity circulation, with its money economy, will disappear as being an unnecessary element in the national economy. But so long as this is not the case, so long as the two basic production sectors remain, commodity production and commodity circulation must remain in force as a necessary and very useful element in our system of national economy. How the formation of a single and united sector will come about, whether simply by the swallowing up of the collective farm sector by the state sector, which is hardly likely, because that would be looked upon as the expropriation of the collective farms, or by the setting up of a single national economic body, comprising representatives of state industry and of the collective farms, with the right, at first, to keep account of all consumer product in the country, and eventually also to distribute it, by way, say, of products exchange, is a special question which requires separate discussion. Consequently, our commodity production is not of the ordinary type, but is a special kind of commodity production without capitalists, which is concerned mainly with the goods of associated socialist producers, the state, the collective farms, the cooperatives, the sphere of action of which is confined to items of personal consumption which obviously cannot possibly develop into capitalist production, and which, together with its money economy, is designed to serve the development and consolidation of socialist production. Wherever commodities and commodity production exist, there the law of value must also exist. In our country, the sphere of operation of the law of value extends, first of all, to commodity circulation, to the exchange of commodities through purchase and sale, the exchange, chiefly, of articles of personal consumption. Here, in this sphere, the law of value preserves, within certain limits of course, the function of a regulator. But the operation of the law of value is not confined to the sphere of commodity circulation. It also extends to production. True, the law of value has no regulating function in our socialist production, but it nevertheless influences production, and this fact cannot be ignored when directing production. As a matter of fact, consumer goods, which are needed to compensate the labor power expended in the process of production, are produced and realized in our country as commodities coming under the operation of the law of value. It is precisely here that the law of value exercises its influence on production. In this connection, such things as cost accounting and profitableness, production costs, prices, etc., are of actual importance in our enterprises. Consequently, our enterprises cannot and must not function without taking the law of value into account. Is this a good thing? It is not a bad thing. Under present conditions, it really is not a bad thing, since it trains our business executives to conduct production on rational lines and disciplines them. It is not a bad thing because it teaches our executives to count production magnitudes, to count them accurately, and also to calculate the real things in production precisely, and not to talk nonsense about approximate figures spun out of thin air. It is not a bad thing because it teaches our executives to look for, find, and utilize hidden reserves latent in production, and not to trample them underfoot. It is not a bad thing because it teaches our executives systematically to improve methods of production, to lower production costs, to practice cost accounting, to make their enterprises pay. It is a good, practical school which accelerates the development of our executive personnel and their growth into genuine leaders of socialist production at the present stage of development. The trouble is not that production in our country is influenced by the law of value. The trouble is that our business executives and planners, with few exceptions, are poorly acquainted with the operations of the law of value, do not study them, and are unable to take account of them in their computations. This, in fact, explains the confusion that still reigns in the sphere of price-fixing policy. The sphere of price-fixing policy is the integral evaluation of economic literacy of the generation of leaders of enterprises and of economists brought up on the basis of the political economy of Marxism. Here is one of many examples. Some time ago, it was decided to adjust the prices of cotton and grain in the interest of cotton growing, to establish more accurate prices for grain sold to the cotton growers, and to raise the prices of cotton delivered to the state. Our business executives and planners submitted a proposal on this score which could not but astound the members of the Central Committee, since it suggested fixing the price of a ton of grain at practically the same level as a ton of cotton. And, moreover, the price of a ton of grain was taken as equivalent to that of a ton of baked bread. In reply to the remarks of members of the Central Committee that the price of a ton of bread must be higher than that of a ton of grain because of the additional expense of milling and baking, and that cotton was generally much dearer than grain, as was also borne out by their prices in the world market, the authors of the proposal could find nothing coherent to say. The Central Committee was therefore obliged to take the matter into its own hands and to lower the prices of grain and raise the prices of cotton. What would have happened if the proposal of these comrades had received legal force? We should have ruined the cotton growers and would have found ourselves without cotton. These fragments demonstrate J.V. Stalin understood that the objective law of value cannot be avoided in the economy during the construction of socialism and communism. However, the ignorance of the directors' corps and economists, an example of which he gives in the quote, hinders the achievement of the highest efficiency of the planned socialist economy of the USSR, including through the inclusion of market mechanisms for self-regulation of the use of objectively available, above-planned capacities. Without overcoming this ignorance, which is impossible in the limitations of economic theories expressing I-centrism, both of Marxism and of private property, the task of combining a socially useful, demographically conditioned plan and a market mechanism into one multi-sectoral production-consumption system is unsolvable. But that is not all. Had the carrying out of debureaucratization been successful, exposing the bureaucrats' criminals and educating the ignorant bureaucrats on the basis of a theory alternative to Marxism, the market mechanism could, by means of the tax subsidy mechanism, have been subordinated to the planned principle and the basic economic law of socialism, and have been included in the economy of socialism. However, the market mechanism as a regulator did not suit J.V. Stalin, since, in the quality of governance towards the economy, it did not guarantee superiority over capitalism, which had already tried to combine in its economy the planned principle of a statewide scale with market self-regulation. Therefore, J.V. Stalin, explaining the question of the law of value under socialism, poses one more task, more significant than the combination of a plan and a market mechanism for self-regulation of the use of above-planned capacities in the national economy of the USSR. In the second phase of communist society, the amount of labor expended on the production of goods will be measured not in a roundabout way, not through value and its forms, as is the case under commodity production, but directly and immediately by the amount of time, the number of hours expended on production of goods. If one clarifies here, technically and organizationally conditioned by technological time, and if one remembers that scientific technological progress and organizational technological progress go into the margin of stability of plans, then everything is correct. No metrologically inconsistent man-hours of labor necessary to accomplish scientific discovery arise. Back to the quote. As to the distribution of labor, its distribution among the branches of production will be regulated not by the law of value, which will have ceased to function by that time, but by the growth of society's demand for goods. It will be a society in which production will be regulated by the requirements of society, and computation of the requirements of society will acquire paramount importance for the planning bodies. If one delves into the essence of accounting of the needs of people and the orientation of production directly towards the identified needs, then this presupposes the creation of a system of production and the creation of a system of governance towards production and distribution of products that ensure the production of almost everything, if not at the rate of issuing an order, then at the rate at which the consumer does not experience unacceptable for him inconveniences during the time in which his order is being fulfilled. Naturally, seeing in this system an alternative to the market, capable of surpassing it in effectiveness, J.V. Stalin did not wait for the building of communism to transition to it, but initiated its action. We still have no developed system of products exchange, but the rudiments of such a system exist in the shape of the merchandising of agricultural products. For quite a long time already, as we know, the products of the cotton growing, flax growing, beet growing, and other collective farms are merchandised. They are not merchandised in full, it is true, but only partly. Still, they are merchandised. Be it mentioned in passing that merchandising is not a happy word and should be replaced by products exchange. The task is to extend these rudiments of products exchange to all branches of agriculture, and to develop them into a broad system under which the collective farms would receive for their products not only money, but also and chiefly the manufactures they need. Such a system would require an immense increase in the goods allocated by the town to the country, and it would therefore have to be introduced without any particular hurry, and only as the products of the town multiply. But it must be introduced unswervingly and unhesitatingly, step by step contracting the sphere of operation of commodity circulation and widening the sphere of operation of products exchange. Such a system, by contracting the sphere of operation of commodity circulation, will facilitate the transition from socialism to communism. Moreover, it will make it possible to include the basic property of the collective farms, the product of collective farming, in the general system of national planning. With a meaningful attitude of the state towards this undertaking, in the process of socio-historical development, it would involve an increasing number of enterprises in all sectors of the economy in this system of self-regulation of production and consumption, on the basis of virtual structures of governance towards production and consumption exchange of products. However, development along this path was suppressed after the assassination of J.V. Stalin. The reformist economists of both the Khrushchev-Brezhnev era and after the collapse of the USSR showed their capitulationism to capitalism. Some showed stupidity, orienting towards the problematics of introducing a functioning market mechanism in Russia, first as a means to improve the functioning of the planned principle, and then as an alleged alternative to it. When reading the above fragments about replacing commodity production and accordingly trade with direct product exchange, one should not think that J.V. Stalin was an idiot, as did the reformers of the early 1990s, who, out of stupidity and zeal, were unable to cope with the attunement of the credit financial system to the accompaniment of product exchange, and brought the country to barter, the exchange trade of primitive times. Those who perceive what was said by him about direct product exchange in this sense are themselves idiots, insensitive to the flow of life, and unable to think. J.V. Stalin had a clear mental picture about how the planned economy of socialism should function in the process of transition to communism, but the culture of society did not have a conceptual, terminological apparatus that would allow him to clearly express his thought. J.V. Stalin did not create this apparatus himself to carry out the day-to-day governance towards the state, and along the way, to recreate philosophy and sociology corresponding to the ideals of communism and the practice of its construction. Moreover, in the atmosphere of the cult of Marxism, in its essence hostile to communism, this turned out to be beyond his strength. Concentrating and holding in his hands the highest public power in the USSR as the leader of the party and head of the state for 30 years, J.V. Stalin on the whole successfully led society to the next transition point of rethinking and reviewing the past and developing intentions for the future. And with the help of those means of expressing thoughts, which the culture of society possessed at that time, he identified and defined those problematics, the unresolvedness of which prevented the further development of society in the USSR and global civilization. And for this one should be grateful to him, as well as for the fact that, in spite of the tendencies characteristic of crowd elitism, he was able to organize victory in the Great Patriotic War. It will not be possible to enter paradise on someone else's hump. These and other problems had to be solved by science. The fact that these problems have not only not been solved by science, primarily on the territory of the USSR, but they have been forgotten, is an expression of the parasitism, intellectual and professional inconsistency of all holders of academic titles, from a candidate of sciences and higher, in the field of philosophy and economics, as well as other branches of sociology. Economic Problems of Socialism in the USSR is an indictment against them. Everything we have cited shows that Economic Problems of Socialism in the USSR also contains an answer to the questions as to why the economic reform of the Khrushchev era, with its system of regional economic Soviets, which was entrusted with the task of governing regional production systems, did not justify itself, and why the Soviet economic reform, also known as the Kosygin reform, of the first half of the 1960s, went wrong and did not provide any useful results, both for socialism and communism, and for the generation of pro-bourgeois dissidents of the 60s, who then did not manage to snatch everything from life, right now. Without solving the problems directly posed or indirectly raised by J.V. Stalin, however, there are no prospects for the current generation of Russian reformers. And the general global crisis of capitalism as a result of this will be aggravated, acquiring more and more faces: ecology, terrorism, epidemics of insanity, and so forth. In addition to what we have considered from Economic Problems of Socialism in the USSR, it also includes less significant, in our opinion, problems that we will not touch upon in this documentary, since their coverage does not correspond to its thematics. Also, along with highlighting the problems that needed to be solved, J.V. Stalin expressed a number of opinions about acceptable and unacceptable governorial decisions in the further advancement of the USSR towards communism. For the most part, these opinions are conditioned by the socio-economic reality that had by those years taken shape in the USSR and are inextricably connected with it. As a consequence of the fact that the Khrushchev psycho-Trotskyist regime led the country on a political course towards the self-liquidation of the achievements of Stalinist Bolshevism, as a result of which other socio-economic circumstances arose, these opinions of J.V. Stalin lost their relevance and are only of historical interest. Therefore, if someone is interested in these questions, then he should turn to the very testament of J.V. Stalin to the Bolsheviks for the future. With the publication of Economic Problems of Socialism in the USSR, the higher-ups of Freemasonry realized that J.V. Stalin was not a Masonic agent in the Bolshevik Party, but a real Bolshevik who caused irreparable damage to the Marxist project of liquidating capitalism and replacing it with inter-Nazi fascism in the economic forms of socialism on a global scale. But it was already too late to take any action in order to save Marxism. Nonetheless, the second part, continuation, of Economic Problems of Socialism in the USSR, according to the testimony of F.I. Chuyev in the book Molotov, the Semi-Sovereign Ruler, J.V. Stalin gave it to V.M. Molotov to read. After the elimination of J.V. Stalin, this book was not published, and nothing is known about its content to this day. For Bolshevism and apostasy from the common cause of Freemasonry, undermining the system of power based on the cult of personalities and the mutual correspondence of esotericism-exotericism, they could not forgive J.V. Stalin, and therefore had to take some actions towards the salvation or modification of the biblical project of enslavement of all. So the 20th Congress became not only a belated revenge of the higher-ups, fueling the biblical project of enslavement of all, on J.V. Stalin, who had passed away, and in whose confidence they were deceived in 1923, but also an attempt, if not to eradicate Bolshevism forever, then to curb the original development of its world understanding, for some as long as possible time, sufficient to replace the Marxist project killed by J.V. Stalin with some new project. The problems created by the capitalism of the biblical civilization still had to be resolved. However, apparently, J.V. Stalin did not confine himself to publishing only Economic Problems of Socialism in the USSR, a work oriented primarily towards the specific conditions of the USSR itself. In 1952 in Madrid, the publishing house Nos published the book Red Symphony, Sinfonia en rojo mayor, by a certain José Landowski, translated into Russian by Mauricio Carlavilla. In the afterword of the translator, it is indicated that the manuscript was found during World War II in a hut near Leningrad, on a corpse with documents addressed to José Landowski by a certain Spaniard named A.I. One might think that he was in the Blue Division of Franco, which fought on the side of the Nazis on the Leningrad front, and was subsequently delivered to Spain. A chapter from this book, entitled X-Ray of Revolution, was published in Russia by the magazine Молодая Гвардия, No. 3/4, 1992, with reference to the 9th Spanish edition, published in Barcelona. This chapter tells the story of the interrogation of the Trotskyist S.G. Rakovsky, allegedly carrying out a special mission of the NKVD in 1938. The interrogation was organized in the form of a conversation over dinner. It is reported that during the interrogation, C.G. Rakovsky was under the influence of psychotropic substances, which deprived him of his ability to restrain himself, as a result of which he answered the questions asked to him sincerely. That is, he said what he really thought. What is published in Молодая Гвардия gives the impression that in order to introduce into public circulation certain information concerning Marxism and the world behind the scenes, the special service that worked for J.V. Stalin personally produced a hoax novel and introduced it into the culture of the West. Therewith, everything that is said about Marxism and the world revolution during the interrogation at the special dacha, the character, named after the real Trotskyist who was sentenced in 1938 to 20 years, C.G. Rakovsky, is true. But the story of how the doctor José Landowski, who was recruited by the NKVD for his outstanding achievements in the field of narcology and toxicology, and who was present during the interrogation, how he was tapping an unaccounted copy of the interrogation transcript with 2 fingers on a typewriter, how he left his job in the NKVD, and the NKVD then forgot about its secret carrier and left him out of sight. As a result of this, during the Great Patriotic War, the secret carrier ended up alone on the Leningrad front, along with his personal archive, which he secretly took from the NKVD from the Special Department, where he lived while working in the NKVD. Thanks to all this sequence of gross violations of the functioning of the system of protecting state secrets in force in the USSR, a personal archive full of secrets was found on the corpse. All this is a hoax, designed to plausibly explain how this information, which really is not subject to public discussion, either in the USSR or in the West in Marxist psycho-Trotskyist circles, became public. All this strongly resembles the real story of how, during the Second World War, Great Britain contributed to the scenario in which A. Hitler ordered preparation for the repelling of the landing of the Allies of the anti-Hitler coalition in Greece in 1943, while the real preparations were being made for the landing in Italy, which was actually carried out. A. Hitler consulted with a personal astrologer, another astrologer, who, through joint work conducted before the war, knew the personal astrologer of A. Hitler, knew his system. During the war years was recruited to work as a consultant in Great Britain in order to duplicate on the basis of a general system of recommendations that A. Hitler received from his personal astrologer. The consultant double came to the opinion that A. Hitler would be given a recommendation that it was necessary to prepare to repel the landing of the Allied troops in Greece. When this was reported to W. Churchill, he gave the order to prepare a landing in Italy, although the headquarters at that time were indeed developing an operation to open a second front in Greece. After that, a corpse in the uniform of a British officer with a briefcase full of secret documents was found in the Atlantic Ocean, from which it followed that a landing and the opening of a second front in Greece were being prepared. These documents were transferred to the leadership of Nazi Germany. All this was accompanied by searches, naturally unsuccessful, by the British for the secret carrier, which also became the property of German intelligence. As a result, the German leadership was convinced that it was correctly preparing to repel the Allied invasion of the continent in Greece, and that it was necessary to continue building up its military potential precisely there. But the landing of the Allies took place in 1943 in Italy, and the personal astrologer of A. Hitler ended his life in a concentration camp. In general, the trick with the corpse of the secret carrier is a standard one in the arsenal of Secret Services scenarios. We do not insist that Joseph Djougashvili wrote not only under the pseudonym of Joseph Stalin, but once published a book in Spain under the pseudonym José Landowski. But the fact that Red Symphony appeared almost simultaneously with Economic Problems of Socialism in the USSR, and that they mutually complement each other thematically, this is not just a game of blind and meaningless chance. Chance, that powerful and instantaneous instrument of providence. In 1997, the writer, formerly better known as a playwright, screenwriter, and now as a historian-analyst, biographer, Edward Radzinsky, wrote the book Stalin. It contains the following passage. We must try to understand the mentality of this Russian intellectual. Our note is that earlier in this text, narration was about the hysterical letters of Bukharin to Stalin from prison. Back to the quote. The upright liar, the helpless strongman, the noble scoundrel, the bold coward, and at the same time immensely talented even in his humiliation, incapable of saying, I simply dread the wrath of these hideously cruel people, he has to invent a great idea to justify his behavior. How well I understand, and yes, love him, for I too am a child of fear. My whole conscious life has been lived in that land of fear. Have pity on me. You who know me so well will understand. This, as can be understood from the quoted fragment, is from Bukharin's letter to Stalin. Yes, Stalin knew them all so well, which was why he had devised the trials. So Radzinsky admits that the raviousness and ethics of one of the most revered by the domestic liberal intelligentsia, innocent victims of Stalinism, left much to be desired. And although he acknowledged this fact in essence, he did not understand that a person with such a raviousness and ethics cannot be innocent. In particular, in a personal letter from prison to J.V. Stalin, after the death sentence had been passed, N.I. Bukharin admits that in the past he was a double dealer, which means he was a criminal in relation to the statehood of the USSR, and tries to assure J.V. Stalin of the fact that now he was finally convinced of the correctness of Stalin, and that Stalin could completely rely on him. But Stalin needed Bukharin's help precisely at that time when he was a double dealer, just like the Apostle Judas. It is also useful to pay attention to the fact that Radzinsky mentions certain deathbed letters of N.I. Bukharin, but does not quote it in his treatise, either in full or in fragments, in our opinion because N.I. Bukharin showed himself in it in such a way that he does not cause sympathy, either as a personality or as a politician and statesman. And Radzinsky did not understand the main thing, but already in relation to himself. One cannot write about that era being a child of fear. But along with his historically inconsistent maxims on the themes of the collapse of Stalin and Stalin's affairs, Radzinsky gives evidence of an episode from the early childhood of J.V. Stalin about his relation towards villainy and praviousness. His friend Davrishevi remembered his grandmother reading the New Testament to them, the story of Judas's kiss of betrayal. But why didn't Jesus draw his saber? Little Soso asked indignantly. He couldn't do that, Grandma answered. He had to sacrifice himself for our salvation. That was something little Soso was incapable of understanding. All through his childhood he had been taught to answer blow with blow. He resolved to do what seemed to him the obvious thing, to take vengeance on the Jews. Even in those days he was a good organizer, but he himself remained behind the scenes, for fear of his mother's heavy hand. One typical plan was carried out by little friends. They let a pig into the synagogue. They were found out, but did not give Soso away. Shortly afterward, an Orthodox priest told his parishioners in church, "There are those among us, some lost sheep, who a few days ago committed a sacrilege in one of God's houses. That was quite beyond Soso's understanding. How could anyone defend people of another faith?" The relation of J.V. Stalin, already in childhood, towards the events in the Garden of Gethsemane, is one of the indicators of the Nravious worldview skeleton, core, of his personality. But Radzinsky distorts the situation. In his relation towards the events in the Garden of Gethsemane, little Soso could not understand how one could indulge the villains. However, in order not to discuss the unpleasant for him personally and for many others question about the essence of villainy in general and his own villainy concretely, Radzinsky also dragged in here an episode with a pig launched by children into a synagogue. The grandmother who read the New Testament to children did not have the opportunity to read the Quran, unlike all our fellow citizens, including Radzinsky, and therefore did not know other opinions about the fate of Jesus, and did not have the opportunity to ponder on what actually happened. The Quran gives another version of what God needed, different from the church version, which was followed by the grandmother. They slew him not, nor crucified him, but it appeared so unto them. And lo, those who disagree concerning it, that is, disagree with the Quranic words, are in doubt thereof. They have no knowledge thereof, save pursuit of a conjecture. In the translation of Daryabadi, they but follow an opinion. They slew him not, for certain, but God took him up unto himself. God was ever mighty. In the translation by Abdullah Yusuf Ali, exalted in power, wise. There is not one of the people of the scripture but will believe in him before his death, and on the day of resurrection he will be a witness against them. Likewise, the episode with the desecration of the synagogue as the house of God is also not in accordance with the theme, if we relate not to the evaluations of Radzinsky, but to life. This was not blasphemy, but it also has a direct relation to the question of the essence of villainy and the relation towards villains. In the synagogue, which was allegedly desecrated by children by throwing a pig into it, and in the church, they taught that the providence of God is expressed in the sociological doctrine of Deuteronomy Isaiah, quoted earlier in part 2 of this documentary cycle. Radzinsky refers to the authority of the representative of the church when he assesses the children's far-from prank as blasphemy, without saying a word about the essence of this doctrine, without giving it a Nravious evaluation. However, there is a point of view that this doctrine is abominable, and that it is attributed to God as an expression of his providence precisely by the apostates. Therefore, the Bible as a whole is a blasphemous book, and thoughtlessly traditional consent of believers with it is villainy. If someone does not have enough fortitude to agree on the basis of their sophist with the expressed opinion, and to step over the fence of the coral of traditional culture, then he should know that there are other traditions, and therefore it is better to think about his direct interrelationship outside of traditions with God who is. In particular, in the Quran, about the essence of the biblical doctrine, it is said directly and univocally, "Those who swallow usury cannot rise up, save as he ariseth whom the devil hath prostrated by his touch. That is because they say, trade is like usury." In the translation by Ali Unal, they say interest is just like trading, whereas God permitteth trading and forbiddeth usury. He unto whom an admonition from his Lord cometh, and he refraineth in obedience thereto, he shall keep the profits of that which is past, and his affair henceforth is with God. As for him who returneth to usury, such are rightful owners of the fire, they will abide therein. God hath blighted usury, and made almsgiving fruitful. In the translation by Muhammad Asad, God deprives usurious gains of all blessing, whereas he blesses charitable deeds with manifold increase. God loveth not the impious and guilty. Lo, those who believe and do good works, and establish worship and pay the poor due, their reward is with their Lord, and there shall be no fear come upon them, neither shall they grieve. Surah 2, 275 to 277. The introduction of clarity in the Quran in the question of the fate of Christ after the prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane, and in the question of the right to usury, are the main reasons as a result of which a biased, negatively dismissive relation towards the Quran and Islam is being deliberately formed in Euro-American civilization, one of the manifestations of which is the preservation, in the majority of translations of the Quran into other languages, of the Arabic word Allah, in order, in the world understanding of people, to smuggle the opinion that Allah is not God, Creator and Almighty, but some other subject of unknown or obviously satanic origin. And according to this point of view, the, as it were, hooliganish prank of children in relation to the pig and the synagogue is not as univocal an act as Radzinsky considers it to be. The child's act objectively expressed the intuitive, unconscious rejection by children of the Church Orthodox connivance to the villainy which was taught and is taught both by the synagogue and the church. Moreover, this act is not so univocal because in Radzinsky's work it is accompanied by a description of the episode in which little So-So, to the measure of his child's understanding, directly raises the question of protecting previousness from villainy by all means, including the use of weapons, the consideration of which Radzinsky in all his written and oral speeches avoids, like the devil avoids incense. And if then the knowledge and intellect of the children were not sufficient for more than just showing, contrary to the culture of adults, their rejection of connivance to villainy, covered by the myth of the inspiration of the Bible in its historically formed by experts from the world behind the scenes shape, then the adult Stalin accomplished already other feats. But Radzinsky is of the opinion that the biblical abominable doctrine of buying up the world on the basis of a racial Jewish monopoly on usury is from God, and therefore Stalin for him is an incorrigible scoundrel from childhood, who, having come to power, destroyed a multitude of upright liars, noble scoundrels, bold cowards, immensely talented even in their humiliation. However, a society of a previous community cannot be made up of scoundrels. But what to do with the villains? Maybe the little boy So-So Jugashvili was right after all, when he asked the question, but why didn't Jesus draw his saber? And this was not an isolated episode in the life of So-So Jugashvili, when he had not yet become Koba or Stalin, but turned to the question of the ways and methods of eradicating villainy from the life of society. From house to house he wandered, knocking at silent doors, his ancient oaken panduri voicing a motive pure, Within the melody's roulades, shining as pure sunstream, dwelled the unvarnished wisdom, truth, and the holy dream. Roused by the lonely chanting, were hearts from a stone-cold sleep. Lingering in the shadows, flame flew above the trees. People who cherished darkness turned from the godly trail, poured no mere wine but poison into his holy grail. Strange are thy words enchanting, truth of yours foreign to us. Drink till your cup is empty, curse you, exclaimed the crowds. Scoundrels, including hypocrites, at the age of 18-19, do not write poetry on such thematics. One of these stanzas is emphasized in bold capital letters by us when quoting, since it gives an answer about the alternative of the higher order in relation to the saber, as a symbol of the protection of previousness from villainy by the force of various kinds of weapons. The only thing that it does not say is that a person is not only a living, beating heart, responsive to life and impacting her course, not only reason and faith towards God and towards ideals, but also a will that is capable of incarnating ideals into life and protecting them, if necessary, by force of arms. And why did J.V. Stalin keep N.I. Bukharin's suicide letter in his desk at the Kremlin? Maybe because he did not have the knowledge and skills that would have allowed him to help N.I. Bukharin in advance to prevail over his own psyche, which would have allowed the latter to avoid the shameful death of a double dealer and apostate from the ideals of the previous community of all. He ends his book about Stalin with the words, 3 weeks later, in August 1991, the crowd smashed statues of the god Lenin and broke windows in the sacred building of his party's Central Committee. The USSR, the greatest of empires, built by the boss to endure through the ages, was crumbling with bewildering rapidity. The Tower of Babel and the Great Dream were no more. Alas, alas, thou great city, thou mighty city, Babylon, in 1 hour thy judgment come. Revelations 18:10. I am the first and the last, and besides me there is no God. Isa 44:6. These words of the Holy Book should have been well known by the pupil of the theological seminary, little Soso Drugashvili, who entered world history under the name of Stalin. We note that the last sentence is absent in the English translation. Soso did know this book, but he had a better opinion of God than E. Radzinsky, and did not attribute to his providence that abomination with which the Bible is full in its old and new slanders against God. And Stalin proved this with his entire life.